Hi guys! Tonight we step straight into the icy darkness of a medieval blizzard, the kind of storm that rattles the shutters of a peasant's cottage and makes even the bravest knight pull his cloak tighter. The wind whips against your cheeks until the skin stings raw, and snowflakes settle thickly on your lashes. You blink, but it doesn't help. The world beyond your nose is swallowed by white, and the only thing you can hear is the shriek of the gale. It's in this moment, standing in a frozen field or trudging along a desolate road, that you realize if you don't build shelter quickly, you probably won't survive this night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a quick comment telling me your location and the local time where you are listening. It always fascinates me to know where these stories are being heard around the world. Now, dim the lights. You take a deep breath and taste cold iron in the air, like biting down on a spoon. Your cloak is soaked through with melted snow. It doesn't matter that you've layered wool beneath. Water finds its way everywhere. Your boots crunch into drifts up to your knees, and every step becomes a battle with the weight of the storm pressing down. Somewhere in the back of your mind you recall that, in medieval Europe, winters were not just cold but sometimes catastrophic. During the so-called Little Ice Age, crops failed, and villages were buried under snow so deep that people dug tunnels between their houses. That's not legend, it's documented fact. The sensation in your fingers is fading. You flex them, trying to stir warmth, but it only makes the ache worse. Snowflakes sting against your eyelids. The road has disappeared, erased in minutes. You imagine peasants, shepherds, and wandering pilgrims facing the same terror centuries ago. For them, this wasn't a dramatic survival tale, it was an annual gamble. Could their homes withstand another storm? Could they reach shelter before the cold turned fatal? You stumble against a half-frozen hedge. The branches scrape your gloved hand, sharp like tiny knives. It's a reminder that nature offers tools as well as threats. In medieval times, travelers often built quick lean-tos from branches, stacking them at angles so the wind would shear off to the side. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than lying exposed. Interestingly, some chronicles describe people surviving blizzards by digging down into snowbanks rather than fighting against them. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? Yet snow, once packed, insulates like wool. Historians still argue whether those makeshift dens were safe or simply acts of desperation that risked suffocation. Your breath clouds before you, briefly visible before being snatched by the wind. You imagine a peasant family clutching one another inside a timber hut, smoke seeping from a hole in the thatch, prayers muttered beneath their breath. One quirky tidbit you might not expect. In parts of Scandinavia, villagers sometimes rub the insides of their walls with fish oil or animal fat. It kept the wood supple, sealed cracks, and oddly made the walls smell like supper long after. The scent would have mingled with smoke, dung, and the musty weight of damp straw, creating a cocktail of survival smells you would never forget. The blizzard thickens. You know you can't stand here much longer. Cold needles work their way beneath your collar, sliding along your spine until you shiver involuntarily. Somewhere ahead, you sense the faint outline of trees, a darker blur against the endless white. Maybe that's where shelter will begin. You push forward, boots dragging, lungs aching. Each step is harder than the last, but the thought of warmth, any warmth at all, drives you on. You wipe the snow from your brow, though it doesn't matter. More flakes land instantly. The storm rages, relentless. You realize medieval survival in such a night wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about building something perfect. It was about cobbling together just enough protection stone, wood, straw, even snow itself to keep your heart beating until dawn. And tonight, that's your challenge too. Snow falls thicker now, every flake joining the others in a conspiracy to bury you alive. Your lashes freeze together when you blink, and the crunch of your boots grows muffled as drifts rise higher around your legs. It feels almost like wading through quicksand, but colder, so much colder. You pause, squinting against the gale. and realize something vital. Snow is not only an enemy tonight, it might also be your best ally. That thought sounds ridiculous at first, but it's the same idea medieval peasants, hunters, and wanderers had to embrace. You reach down and scoop a handful. It squeaks faintly in your glove, dry and powdery. Not all snow is the same, you remember. Powder slips away, useless for shaping. But damp, heavy snow, the kind that clumps together like dough, is different. With it, people built walls, shelters, and even snow huts. That's a mainstream fact historians highlight when they describe the ingenuity of northern peoples. They didn't fight snow so much as coax it into cooperation. And here you stand, shivering, wondering whether you should pile it high yourself. You imagine a medieval shepherd stranded far from home, caught in a sudden storm while tending his flock. There's no chance of reaching the village. Instead, he would carve into a drift, hollowing it like an animal burrow. Inside, the air would grow still. The snow outside, though freezing to the touch, would form a barrier that trapped the heat of breath and body. It sounds almost magical, but science explains it. Snow is a poor conductor of heat. It lets warmth linger, turning a deadly blizzard into a cocoon. You hesitate. Should you try digging? You look around and spot a mound already half formed by the wind. The surface is crusted, the kind you can push through with effort. Kneeling down, your knees instantly numb against the white, you punch through the crust and scoop out a space. Snow tumbles in on itself, threatening collapse. It's clumsy work, yet strangely soothing. The rhythm of carving, scooping, piling again and again distracts from the gnaw of cold in your bones. One quirky tidbit comes to mind. Medieval chronicles tell of soldiers in the Baltic campaigns who built crude igloo-like shelters, not because they were taught by locals, but because they stumbled into the idea after watching how animals burrowed into drifts. Imagine a knight, armored and exhausted, crawling into a hole in the snow like a fox. He'd wake to find frost clinging to his beard, but still alive. Dignity be damned, survival mattered more than appearances. Of course, historians still debate whether these improvised snow shelters were common practice or rare acts of desperation. The records are vague, caught between legend and memory. Some accounts insist people preferred timber and stone whenever possible. Others whisper of whole groups vanishing into snow caves, their fires extinguished by lack of air. You feel that uncertainty yourself as you carve deeper. The space grows tighter. Your breath warms the little pocket around you, but moisture drips down the walls. Will this refuge hold or suffocate? You lean back, pressing your shoulders into the curve. The storm outside muffles, reduced to a low moan like a distant beast. It's quieter here, almost comforting. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. A thin sheen of frost already forms on your cloak where it touches the wall. Your body heat makes the snow damp, and droplets slide slowly downward. The smell is clean, sharp, like freshly laundered linen, but with the faint metallic tang of ice. You think about medieval children who played in snow by day, and then huddled into snow shelters by night. For them, perhaps, the fear was mingled with wonder. Parents might reassure them that snow was protective, not cruel, while secretly praying the storm would pass. In some villages, snow was even called the poor man's plaster, because it sealed roofs and walls when nothing else could. Picture peasants pushing snow against the outside of huts to stop drafts. Odd, isn't it? The very substance threatening to bury them was the same one keeping warmth in. Shivering, you try to imagine what a medieval traveller carried to help in such moments. Likely nothing fancy, no down sleeping bag, no waterproof tarp, maybe just a coarse wool blanket, a knife, and faith. Wool, after all, retains heat even when wet, a detail that has saved countless lives through history. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling how the damp fabric still clings with some stubborn warmth. Time stretches inside your snowy hollow. The blizzard outside howls, but in here it's muted, like listening through layers of cloth. You reach out and touch the wall again, fingertips pressing into the packed surface. It's firm now, more solid than you expected, as if the storm itself has granted you a fortress. You exhale slowly, mist drifting into the dimness, and imagine how monks, soldiers, and wanderers centuries ago must have felt when the snow turned from predator into partner. Of course, there are risks. You recall a tale from Norway about villagers who built snow caves during a blizzard only to have their roofs collapse under sudden weight. They crawled out gasping, faces blue, eyes wide with terror. Survival strategies always carried double edges. What saved one person doomed another. That's the lesson you carry tonight. Snow is ally, snow is foe, snow is both. Your toes throb. The chill seeps into bones despite the insulated silence. You curl them, wiggle them, try to coax warmth. The thought of medieval remedies passes your mind like heating stones in the fire and tucking them under blankets or filling clay pots with embers. Here, though, no fire burns, no pot glows. Just your breath, your body, and the thin trust you've placed in white walls. You realize something else. Silence itself can be dangerous. As the storm muffles, you grow drowsy. You think of those who succumbed not to hunger or collapse, but to sleep lured into icy dreams. It's why, perhaps, stories of snow spirits or frost demons linger in old folklore, reminders to stay awake, to resist the lull. A quirky superstition from Russia warned that if you closed your eyes in the snow, spirits would steal your soul. Whether true or not, the advice was practical: don't let sleep claim you in the cold. You force your eyes open. Focus on the flicker of light where your hollow meets the storm outside. That thin crack means air, means life. You breathe deeply, steadying yourself, and remind your mind that morning always comes, even after the fiercest blizzards. And so you wait, inside a shelter made of the very thing you feared, listening to the muted roar of a storm that has not yet finished testing you. The sound changes when you finally stumble into the trees. Out in the open, the wind roared like an angry sea, but beneath the forest canopy, it hisses and whines, weaving through branches that creak and groan as if alive. Snow still falls, sifting steadily, but the dense pines and oaks catch much of it on their limbs. You tilt your head back, watching the weight bend branches downward until they almost touch the ground. Somewhere in that bending, in the tangle of wood and shadow, you sense opportunity. The forest has always been humankind's first refuge. Your boots crunch across a carpet of needles, the smell of resin sharp in your nostrils. Here, the snow is thinner, broken by roots and leaves. The change is subtle, but you can feel it. The air stings less. It is still bitter, still dangerous, but the trees have softened the storm's bite. Medieval wanderers would have felt the same relief, collapsing at the edge of a forest and knowing the wind could no longer strike them full force. This is why so many early shelters rose within or along the forest line, where materials waited at arm's reach. You run your fingers over a low branch, bark rough against the skin of your gloves. In the Middle Ages, villagers harvested bark as readily as timber, not just for firewood or tools, but for shelter walls. Thin strips of birch bark, layered and overlapped, could serve as shingles. Oak branches, still green and springy, bent into frames for quick lean-tos. And pine resin, sticky, fragrant, stubborn, was daubed into cracks to block the wind. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering: resin sealed medieval boats and roofs alike, proving its value as nature's glue long before chemistry had a name. You crouch to gather fallen branches. They're brittle, snapping sharply under your weight. Some still hold a whisper of green, others crumble into dust. You imagine a peasant family doing the same on a winter's eve, the children dragging sticks, the parents arranging them in a hasty frame. Above, they'd lean larger branches into a triangular roof, then heap snow, moss, or leaves on top. Crude, yes, but in a storm, crude was enough. Shelter was not about beauty. It was about beating the cold, long enough to see dawn. There's an odd tidbit whispered in folklore. Some communities believed that certain trees offered more warmth than others, not just physically, but spiritually. Hazel, for example, was thought to repel evil, while oak stood as a guardian. To sleep beneath them was to rest under protection. You can picture a weary medieval traveller deliberately choosing a spot beneath a sacred tree, whispering a prayer before curling into the roots. Whether protection came from spirit or physics, strong branches against snow, it hardly mattered. Comfort often begins with belief. You select a hollow between two thick trunks. It feels natural, like an alcove already half formed. Snow piles at the base, drifted and sculpted by the wind. With your hands you scrape it back, clearing a small space down to the frozen earth. The soil smells faintly of rotten pine, earthy and reassuring, a reminder of life beneath all this whiteness. The space is cramped, but that closeness is your ally. Warmth is kept where air is small. You start layering. First, long branches leaned against the trunks, meeting at an angle overhead. Then smaller twigs, woven haphazardly to fill the gaps. It's awkward work, fingers stiff and clumsy, but the frame takes shape. Over it you heap pine boughs, their needles prickly, their scent pungent. The green dulls the white world, creating a pocket of colour and life. Historians still debate whether medieval shelters of this kind, temporary forest lean-tos, were common, or whether written accounts exaggerate them. But as you crouch under your makeshift roof, you feel the logic. When the storm raged, you used what the forest offered. Nothing else mattered. You pause and listen. The howl of the wind is dulled. Snow falls more quietly, slipping off boughs in sudden dumps that thud softly onto the ground. The soundscape here is intimate, branches creaking like doors, needles rustling like whispers. You feel wrapped in a cocoon of wood and silence. Your breath fogs the air, curling upward until it disappears into the darkness above. You imagine medieval hunters returning from the chase, dragging carcasses behind them, desperate for a dry corner to skin their kill. They might huddle beneath the same kind of crude hut, smoke from a small fire curling out the entrance. The smell of pine would mingle with meat, smoke, and sweat. For children, perhaps, this was adventure. For parents, necessity. There's a quirky report from an early Norse saga that describes men building shelters by propping shields against trees and covering them with cloaks. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? A military kit turned into a hut. But it reveals a deeper truth. Anything, truly anything, could become part of a shelter when snow threatened life. Even in war, survival came before glory. Your shelter creaks as the storm presses down. Snow begins to heap against the outer walls, but instead of fear, you feel a strange calm. Every added layer of snow is insulation. Every drift against the boughs seals you tighter inside. It's the same paradox you discovered earlier. Snow threatens and saves in the same breath. You sit back, pulling your knees close, listening to the muted sigh of the storm. Your body protests. Toes throb, fingers ache, muscles twitch with fatigue. You shift, settling onto the forest floor. It is hard and unforgiving, but at least it's out of the wind. You can almost imagine a medieval monk writing by candlelight in a cloister, the walls thick and silent, while peasants like you shivered in lean-tos nearby. Two worlds divided by stone, but sharing the same winter. Your eyes wander upward through a small gap in the roof. Snowflakes drift lazily down, glowing faintly in the moonlight. They land on your face, melt, and trickle cold along your skin. You brush them away, but the sensation lingers. It's oddly comforting, this dance of cold and warmth, as if the storm itself is tucking you in. Historians note that medieval villagers often cleared paths to forests even in winter, because wood was survival. Every twig, every log mattered. You think of that as you nestle deeper into your crude shelter. The forest isn't just backdrop, it's lifeline. Without it, peasants would not have endured centuries of harsh winters. And so you lie here, under branches that groan and sway, surrounded by resin's sharp perfume, listening to the muffled song of a storm outside. The forest has embraced you, just as it embraced countless others through centuries. Tomorrow, you may move on. But tonight, the trees are your walls, your roof, your guardians against the blizzard's endless hunger. You leave the shelter of the trees behind and step into a low, wind-swept hollow. At first glance, it looks like an unpromising dip in the landscape, a shallow depression scooped out by water long ago. But here, shielded from the howling air above, you realize why medieval travelers often dug downward instead of building upward. When roofs threatened collapse, earth itself became the roof. You kneel and press your gloved hand into the drift. The snow is firm on top, soft beneath. By scraping at the crust, you can quickly carve out a pit. The deeper you go, the less the wind can reach you. Archaeological digs in northern Europe have uncovered faint outlines of pits filled with charcoal, animal bones, and burned soil, suggesting that people truly did hunker down in such hollows, fires smouldering at their feet. These traces don't look like grand houses. They look like survival scratched directly into the earth. You shovel snow aside with your hands, your breath coming in ragged bursts. Each scoop exposes darker soil, hard and frozen but oddly reassuring. The earth smells damp, metallic, almost like blood on iron. For medieval peasants, digging into the ground was both desperate and instinctive. Soil insulated, walls held, and the shape of the pit kept heat from vanishing into the air. Imagine a family crouched in such a hole, cloaks drawn tight, voices hushed, watching sparks dance upward into the night. Travelers' tales mention a strange habit. Sometimes people spread animal hides along the walls of these pits, not only to block drafts but also to keep out dampness. The hides stiffened in the cold, rattling faintly when the wind shook them, like frozen drums. Odd though it sounds, the method worked well enough. Beneath the skins, warmth clung longer, and where hides were scarce, bundles of rushes or even frozen turf served the same purpose. Still, academic debate continues about whether these earth-dug shelters were used primarily in emergencies or as planned winter lodgings. Some researchers argue they were never more than last resorts, quickly abandoned once storms eased. Others insist they were semi-regular shelters for shepherds, woodsmen, and even traders crossing snowy passes. The truth may never be certain, for pits and hollows collapse quickly, leaving little more than stains in the soil. You can sense that uncertainty yourself, as you crouch inside one now, feeling how flimsy and fragile the protection island. You sit back, drawing your knees close. The snow wall rises around you like a frozen amphitheater. Overhead, the sky has vanished, replaced by a roof of swirling flakes. It is quieter down here. The blizzard's fury passes just above your head, leaving only muffled sighs. Your breath condenses in front of you, mist curling and drifting before vanishing into the dimness. In the distance, you can picture a medieval soldier marching with his company, suddenly trapped in a whiteout. No timber, no stone, no roof, just snow and earth. The men dig furiously, scraping hollows with daggers and helmets. They cram themselves into the depressions, pressed shoulder to shoulder. The smell of sweat, fear, and damp wool fills the air. Outside, horses stand shivering, tails whipped by the gale. By dawn, those who manage to dig deepest crawl out alive, while those who remained exposed lie stiff in the drifts. Oddly enough, folklore preserved echoes of these pit shelters. In parts of the Alps, there were sayings about sleeping in the belly of the mountain, a phrase that described both caves and snow pits. The metaphor stuck because that is how it felt. To crawl into the ground, to surrender yourself to Earth's embrace, and to hope you were reborn come morning. Your toes throb again, dull aches spreading up your legs. You wiggle them, trying to fight off numbness. You think of medieval remedies, stones heated in the fire and dropped into pits, glowing faintly red, surrounded by straw. The heat would radiate for hours. Some even carried little clay jars filled with embers, held close under cloaks. The risk of sparks was real, but so was the risk of frostbite. Choose your enemy carefully. As you lean against the wall of your hollow, you notice how the wind fills the pit with fine powder. You brush it aside again and again. Snow is relentless, creeping back into every corner you clear. You realize how medieval survivors must have felt constantly fighting, not just cold, but the snow itself as a living thing. Every movement, every breath was a small rebellion against it. There's an unexpected comfort here, though. The earth beneath you is solid, unshaken by gusts. The walls curve naturally, holding you close. Even in this primitive shelter, you feel safer than you did in the open. That sense of containment is almost soothing, as if the world has been reduced to a small, manageable size. You can imagine a frightened child curling up against their mother, both pressed into such a pit, finding comfort not in warmth but in the knowledge that they were together, hidden from the blizzard's eye. Your mind drifts to a peculiar account recorded in a 14th century monastic chronicle. During a violent storm, villagers in the mountains supposedly dug so many pits that the fields looked like a graveyard by morning. Whether that detail is true or embroidered by imagination, the image lingers. A landscape dotted with holes, each one cradling a family or a traveler, each one a silent struggle for survival. You shift again, cloak rustling softly. Your back aches from the hard earth. You stretch, careful not to collapse the sides. This is the paradox you keep returning to. Safety balanced on fragility. One wrong move, and your wall could crumble, exposing you once more to the storm's teeth. That balance between endurance and collapse is the story of every medieval winter. The storm still rages above, but down here you feel calmer. The snow may smother, the cold may bite, but the earth has accepted you for now. And in the stillness, in the faint warmth of your own body, you realize why people of the Middle Ages turned to pits and hollows. Because sometimes the only way to survive the storm was not to resist it, but to bury yourself within it. The storm slackens for a moment, and you seize the chance to climb out of your pit. The snow has stopped pelting quite so fiercely, though the wind still claws at your face. As you move across the whitened field, your eyes catch a darker mound on the horizon. It isn't a tree or drift. No, it's something sturdier stones stacked in deliberate form. You draw closer, and you realize what it is. A turf hut, its walls layered with earth and rock, its roof nearly swallowed by snow. These were not temporary shelters, but seasonal structures built with patience and strength. In parts of Scotland, Iceland, and the Northern Isles, people raised thick walls from whatever they had at hand, stones gathered from fields, clods of turf cut in heavy slabs, sometimes even sods of moss stitched with roots. The result looked humble, almost like a hill itself, but inside, warmth could linger. Written records from medieval Iceland confirm that families wintered in such huts, their ceilings low, their walls half earth and half stone. To the outsider they looked primitive, to the dweller they were life-saving. You brush the snow away from the entrance, a narrow dark slit barely large enough to crawl through. The wooden lintel above the doorway is warped and swollen. You duck your head and step inside. At once the world changes. The howl of the storm fades to a muffled hum. The smell greets you first. Damp earth mixed with smoke. A scent that clings to hair and fabric. A reminder that fires once burned here. The floor is hard-packed soil, uneven and cracked. The walls are rough but thick, nearly a meter in places. You press your hand to the surface. It's cold, yes, but solid, like the bones of the land itself. Contemporary accounts make clear that turf huts were common across windswept landscapes where timber was scarce. Iceland, especially, saw widespread use of this method. Imagine a winter village, the houses not tall and proud but low, almost vanishing into the ground, smoke curling from small holes in the roofs. These were homes built not for grandeur but for endurance. They absorbed the storm, crouching close to the earth like animals. A curious detail emerges in sagas. Some huts had grass growing on their roofs even in winter, the green blades poking through snow. It must have looked strange to travelers, as if the earth itself were alive, sprouting houses. This wasn't decorative, though. Grass bound the turf, kept it from sliding off, and added insulation. When spring returned, sheep might graze on the roof while families huddled beneath. Odd, yes, but practical. You run your fingers along the wall, feeling the layers of stone and soil pressed together. You picture the builders at work months before winter. Men cut turf blocks with spades, stacking them like bricks. Women packed earth into gaps. Children hauled stones from the fields, laughing despite the labor. By the time snow fell, the hut stood ready, a structure born from sweat and foresight. This was no last-minute lean-to. It was planned, deliberate, built with the storm already in mind. Yet historians remain divided on how effective these huts truly were. Some argue they were damp, smoky, and unhealthy, breeding illness. Others claim they provided stable warmth, especially when lined with wooden planks or hides. Archaeological remains show hearths blackened with soot, suggesting fires burned constantly. But the absence of chimneys raises questions. How breathable was the air inside? Perhaps people traded comfort for survival, lungs blackened with smoke but hearts still beating when spring arrived. You crouch in the middle of the hut. The roof dips low, supported by timber poles now blackened with age. You imagine a medieval family gathered here, bodies pressed close, livestock tethered near the door. The sound of bleating sheep or lowing cows would mingle with the hiss of fire and the murmur of voices. Heat from beasts and humans alike warmed the small space. The air would be thick, stifling at times, but better than the icy void outside. One odd practice noted in Norse tradition involved burying fish bones beneath the floor of turf huts. It may have been superstition, a charm for fertility and protection, or perhaps it was simple disposal. Either way, the idea lingers. Every hut carried with it layers of not only earth and stone but also memory and belief. The walls held stories as well as warmth. You sit quietly, listening to the storm's muffled echo beyond the wall. The turf absorbs sound, creating a hush that feels almost sacred. Your breath echoes faintly in the chamber. The walls seem to lean in, close and heavy, but protective. You close your eyes for a moment, picturing monks writing in illuminated manuscripts, while far to the north, families crouched in these huts, surviving blizzards with little more than fire, stone, and sod. Two worlds, one of parchment and prayer, one of earth and survival, but both bound by winter's demand for endurance. The longer you linger, the more you notice the subtleties. The faint draft sneaking through the doorway, the drip of melted snow trickling down one wall, the soot stains fanning across the ceiling, all reminders that this shelter was never perfect. But perfection was never the goal. As you run your hand over the damp turf, you realize the hut's real strength lay in its stubbornness. It clung to the earth, and so did those within. You stand and look back at the doorway, where a dim light filters in. Outside, the storm continues, relentless. But inside this mound of soil and stone, you feel steadier. This, perhaps, is the lesson these huts whisper across centuries, that survival sometimes means crouching low, leaning into the land, and letting it cover you like a blanket. When you push out of the turf hut, snow cascades off the roof in a lazy slide. The air is sharper now, icy needles pricking your cheeks, but you can see faint outlines of structures further downslope. Roofs, angled steeply, poking through heaps of white. They are thatched cottages, simple, straw-covered homes that tried to balance beauty with practicality, but often betrayed their owners when winter struck hardest. Thatched roofs were a familiar sight across medieval Europe, from England to Poland. They were cheap, renewable, and surprisingly versatile. Bundles of reed, straw, or rush were layered thick and pegged down with wooden spars. When dry, they shed water gracefully, the rain running off in rivulets. But snow was another matter. Heavy drifts pressed down mercilessly, and a roof that could shrug off rain sometimes collapsed under winter's weight. Chronicles from the 14th century mention entire cottages flattened after a single night of snowfall, families clawing out from beneath broken beams. You step closer, brushing snow from a slanted wall. The thatch is stiff, frozen solid. Its surface bristles like the back of a hedgehog, sharp ends protruding through the ice. Inside, the air smells musty, faintly sweet with the scent of old straw. You imagine the texture under your hands scratchy, uneven, yet familiar. The same material peasants used not only for roofs but for bedding, fodder, and even shoes stuffed tight against the cold. Contemporary accounts describe villages repairing thatch just before winter, climbing ladders with fresh bundles, weaving them into the sagging roofline. It was communal labor, neighbors helping neighbors, children fetching straw from stacks, women binding sheaves with twine. The roof, once renewed, looked golden against the grey sky, almost cheerful. But within weeks, snow would begin its assault, heavy, unrelenting, testing every stitch of their effort. An unusual practice sometimes employed was snow-sweeping villagers would climb onto the roofs with crude shovels and push snow off before it compacted. Picture it. A man balanced precariously on icy straw, wind howling, each movement threatening to pitch him to the ground. Yet without that work, the weight could crush the rafters. One travel diary from 15th century Germany notes that peasants tied ropes around their waists so neighbors could haul them back up if they slipped. A risky job, but essential. And here lies a puzzle. Architectural historians disagree about just how reliable thatch was in deep snow zones. Some argue it was hopeless, constantly collapsing, while others insist its steep pitch, when properly built, actually shed snow as effectively as rain. The truth likely depended on skill, resources, and luck. In milder winters it sufficed. In harsher years it failed spectacularly. You can see both sides of the argument, standing beneath this sloping roof, wondering whether it would shield you or bury you. You crouch lower, peering into the gloom inside. A family would have gathered here, straw mats laid on the floor, smoke seeping from a central fire pit. The walls trembled under the storm's push. Yet the family carried on, mothers weaving, fathers repairing tools, children chasing each other through the haze. Their laughter, muffled by thick walls, would have been a rebellion against the snow outside. Still, always there was the fear. A creak, a groan in the rafters, a reminder that collapse was only ever a possibility away. Oddly enough, some folklore treated thatch almost as a living thing. In English superstition, people whispered that spirits hid in the straw bundles. If the roof was neglected, misfortune would strike. So before winter, peasants sometimes muttered blessings as they fixed the roof, appealing not only to practical skill but to unseen guardians. It sounds quaint, but in truth, any hope of protection was welcome when survival felt uncertain. You run your fingers through a loose tuft of straw near the doorway. It crumbles between your gloves, leaving a faint powdery dust. You imagine lying on such straw at night, the stalks scratching your skin, the smell earthy and overwhelming. Comfort was relative. Compared to bare stone, straw was a gift. Compared to feather bedding, it was hardship. For most, it was the only choice. The wind surges again, rattling the roof above. Snow falls in clumps from the eaves, thudding heavily. You think about the ingenuity required. Timber frames, straw tied in courses, layers overlapping like shingles. This was peasant engineering at its finest. Affordable, functional, imperfect, but enduring across centuries. Without it, villages would never have spread so widely across Europe's cold fields. Your thoughts wander to an odd example recorded in Ireland. Some households mixed mud and animal dung into their thatch to improve binding. Unpleasant to imagine, but effective, the sticky mixture keeping straw from slipping under weight. The smell must have been pungent, clinging to the air even after months of weathering. Yet survival excused such methods. Better a foul odor than a roofless night in the snow. Standing in the dim interior, you notice how close the walls feel. Thatched cottages were often small, single rooms shared by entire families and sometimes livestock. Heat from animals rose, trapped by the low roof. The thatch absorbed smoke, turning black with soot. Children coughed, eyes watered, but still they were alive. Outside, wolves prowled the edges of frozen fields. Inside, the family endured together, bound by necessity. You step back outside, blinking at the brightness. The cottage squats beneath its snowy burden, patient, stubborn. In its fibers are the stories of countless winters, of villagers balancing fear with resilience. And as you turn away, the storm gusting once more across the plain, you understand why straw, fragile as it seems, was trusted for so long. Because in the end, survival wasn't about perfection. It was about making do with what the land provided, however scratchy, smoky, or flawed. The storm refuses to let up. Snow still swirls in ghostly eddies, finding every gap in your clothing, and the cold gnaws steadily at your bones. You press forward across the white fields until another outline emerges from the haze, a squat shelter with walls that look more like woven baskets than solid stone. As you draw closer, you recognize the pattern. Wattle walls, thin rods of wood intertwined and plastered with mud. In a storm, they creaked and groaned under pressure, but they stood all the same. Wattle and daub construction was everywhere in medieval Europe, especially in villages where stone was scarce and timber too precious to waste on thick beams. Thin willow or hazel rods were cut, bent, and woven between upright stakes like giant wickerwork. The gaps were filled with daub, a paste of clay, soil, straw, and sometimes even dung. The result was surprisingly sturdy and far cheaper than masonry. Written manorial surveys from England in the 13th century describe entire hamlets built almost entirely from these pliable walls. They were quick to raise, affordable, and when well maintained, capable of lasting decades. You run your hand along one wall, feeling the uneven ridges where the weave shows through. It trembles faintly in the wind, as if the shelter itself shivers, yet inside, it is warmer than the blizzard's edge. The daub, now frozen hard, seals the wind out. Your breath fogs the air, and you smell damp clay mixed with straw, the scent of wet earth clinging even in winter. Accounts from medieval chroniclers note how these walls were patched constantly. A family might spend summer redaubing their house, mixing fresh clay with chopped straw, slapping it onto the frame by hand. Children would join, muddy to the elbows, laughing as they smeared paste across the weave. When winter came, the walls hardened like stone. This communal labor was both practical and bonding, proof that survival depended on every pair of hands. But these structures carried vulnerabilities. Snow piled against them could turn the clay to sludge, leaving gaps that whistled with drafts. And when frost thawed suddenly, whole panels sometimes collapsed. That tension divides modern experts. Some argue wattle walls were inadequate in severe winters, while others insist their flexibility helped them bend rather than break under stress. Both sides have evidence. Archaeological remains of medieval villages often reveal impressions of woven rods preserved in the soil, ghostly reminders of walls long gone. Inside the hut, you imagine the life it once contained. A central hearth smokes faintly, the black residue staining the roof beams. The air is hazy, thick with the mingled smells of wood smoke and damp thatch. A family huddles near the fire, the father weaving more rods into a broken section of wall, the mother tending a pot of thin stew, the children whispering stories to distract themselves from the howling outside. Every creak of the wall reminds them of nature's power but also of their own resourcefulness. One curious custom mentioned in folklore: villagers sometimes pressed handprints into wet daub as charms, believing the mark of a human palm would protect the house from collapse. Others embedded small tokens, beads, bits of bone, or carved crosses into the walls as offerings. To us, it might seem superstition. To them, it was reinforcement of both wall and spirit. Perhaps, as snow pressed against their woven huts, those charms gave them confidence to sleep. You lean against the wall and feel it sway gently. The sensation is unsettling, as if you are standing against the side of a ship. You realize how frightening it must have been in the dead of night, hearing the groan of timbers, wondering if the walls would hold. Yet the rhythm of daily life continued regardless. People cooked, spun wool, sharpened tools, even made love in those fragile houses, proving that existence was not just survival, it was insistence on living. A story survives in a 15th century parish account of a storm so fierce it toppled dozens of wattle cottages in a single night. The priest wrote of families gathering in the church nave, huddled together until the winds passed. Yet within weeks, the villagers returned, weaving new walls, smearing new clay, refusing to abandon their fields. It is this resilience you sense in every woven rod, every lump of frozen daub around you. You crouch low, watching snow drift through a small crack near the roofline. A fine powder settles on the floor, glittering faintly in the firelight. You brush it aside, feeling again how relentless the storm is always testing, always pushing. But the shelter holds, creaking like an old ship's hull yet refusing to break. Oddly, the woven pattern gives a strange comfort. It resembles fabric, or a basket, or even the weave of a fence. It reminds you of how medieval people saw little separation between house and tool, between home and handcraft. The same skills used to make fences for sheep or baskets for grain were used to build walls against winter. Craftsmanship itself was survival. Your mind drifts to the sounds. The whistle of wind through tiny cracks, the pop of the fire, the murmur of voices sharing stories to distract from the storm. Imagine a grandmother telling tales of saints and spirits while snow piled outside, her words stitching as much warmth as the fire did. In such moments, frail walls were not failures, they were reminders that community itself was the strongest shelter. And as you step back into the storm, the woven hut fading into snow behind you, you understand. These walls, humble and creaking, stood not just because of timber and clay, but because of the will of those who made them. Survival was never only about strength, it was about persistence, patched year after year, as stubborn as the people who called these fragile shelters home. You stagger forward, the blizzard still clawing at your back, until you come upon a low structure that seems oddly alive with sound. At first, it is only the faint shuffle of movement, a muffled grunt. Then comes the warmer breath of air, the unmistakable scent of hay mixed with something musky and strong. You realize you have reached one of the most peculiar, and yet most practical, survival strategies of the medieval world: sharing shelter with animals. In villages across Europe, it was common to build houses with a byre, an area where livestock and humans slept under the same roof. Archaeological digs in places like Bavaria and Scandinavia confirm this, showing longhouses where one half held people and the other half held cattle. It was not a matter of choice, it was necessity. Cows, sheep, and goats radiated warmth. In the dead of winter, their body heat made the difference between life and death. You imagine a peasant family ushering their animals inside during a blizzard, the door shut tight, the room thick with breath, and the air heavy but survivable. The sensation hits you as soon as you duck inside: humid warmth, rich with the smell of dung and wet hides. The floor is layered with straw, soft underfoot, though damp patches squelch unpleasantly. It is not a noble's hall, it is a barn turned into a lifeboat. Yet here, in this mingling of species, survival takes on a strange intimacy. The family huddles against one wall, wrapped in blankets, while cows shift and chew cud a few feet away. Chickens cluck softly from rafters. The heat is palpable, steaming your face, making your fingers tingle back to life. Contemporary manorial rolls record fines for peasants who failed to keep animals inside at night, not for cruelty, but because the lords knew the animals' warmth reduced mortality. These records show just how institutionalized the practice was. It wasn't simply a peasant trick, it was policy. And there are stranger details. Some medieval medical texts recommended inhaling cow breath to ease chest ailments, claiming it softened the lungs. Imagine that families pressed close to their livestock, telling themselves that every steaming exhale was medicine. Odd to modern ears, yet it fit a world where daily life blurred human and animal in ways we rarely experience today. Of course, scholars argue over how tolerable these conditions really were. Some insist the air must have been unbearable, laden with ammonia, smoky from poor hearths, and thick with fleas. Others counter that constant fires, open vents in the roof, and layers of straw made it manageable. Perhaps the truth sits in the middle. Unpleasant, yes, but survivable. You close your eyes, listening. The creak of beams, the shifting of hooves, the low murmur of voices, there is a rhythm here, almost comforting. The blizzard beyond is muted, a dull roar on the other side of thick walls. Here, life continues in defiance of it. Children whisper stories, stroking the coarse hair of calves. Mothers mend clothes by firelight, their needles glinting faintly. Fathers lean against the warm flanks of cows, drowsing, grateful for the heat that seeps into their bones. There is even a peculiar note in folklore. Some people believed cows could see spirits, so keeping them inside would ward off malevolent forces during storms. If a cow lowed suddenly in the night, families whispered it was warning of something unseen. Whether this was superstition or simply the imagination of people trapped indoors too long, it added a layer of mystery to the already strange companionship. You shift on your feet, brushing straw from your cloak. The warmth is undeniable, even if the smell makes your eyes sting. This is survival stripped bare of pride. Humans and animals together, equal in their need for shelter. The hut itself seems alive. Every breath a cloud, every movement a reminder that life persists in many forms. A chronicler in the Swiss Alps once described peasants living like beasts with beasts, but his words were not entirely scornful. He noted that such households suffered fewer winter deaths than wealthier families in stone manors, where fires alone had to do the work. It is a paradox worth pondering. Poverty's solutions sometimes proved more effective than nobility's comforts. Your own body warms in the humid air. The stiffness in your toes eases, the ache in your hands lessens. You stretch, almost sighing, though the odor clings, thick and sour. Comfort is relative, you remind yourself. For medieval peasants, this was not degradation. It was strategy, honed over centuries, passed from parent to child. And as you lean against the wall, listening to the storm's fury outside and the steady chewing of a cow beside you, you realize the profound truth of this arrangement. Survival has never cared much for dignity. It cares for warmth, for breath, for one more dawn. And here, amid steaming hides and damp straw, that chance at dawn feels possible. The storm drags you onward, snow whipping like claws across your cheeks, until you find yourself following the faint gleam of ice. At first, it looks like a frozen field. Then you realize you are standing on the surface of a river, solid and glassy beneath the snow. The current sleeps under its icy lid, invisible but restless. People in the Middle Ages crossed rivers like this when bridges were scarce, dragging sleds, wagons, or even entire herds across the glittering skin. Sometimes, they built shelters on this uncertain stage. You imagine desperate travelers caught between villages, night falling faster than their legs can carry them. The only flat ground for miles is the frozen river, its surface smooth and wide. They stack branches, lash together sleds, and heap snow to form a barrier against the wind. Fires burn in shallow pits scraped directly onto the ice, their flames reflecting in trembling orange patterns. For a brief time, the river itself seems to cradle them. Records from northern Europe mention such makeshift encampments. Pilgrims, merchants, even soldiers sometimes slept on frozen rivers when storms trapped them mid-journey. One 15th century merchant's journal describes men huddling around a brazier set on planks over the ice, their breath mixing with smoke, their prayers constant that the ice would hold. For them, the river was both road and roof. You crouch, brushing snow from the frozen surface. The ice is solid, but groans faintly under your weight, like the low growl of some ancient creature. Beneath, black water flows unseen, the true danger. Your reflection flickers in the dark sheen, distorted by cracks. The cold radiates upward, seeping into your bones as if the earth itself were hollow and hungry. One curious detail from folklore: in certain regions, people scattered salt on the ice before building shelters, believing it would calm the river spirits. Salt was precious, yet they used it as a kind of offering, buying peace from the unseen. To us it sounds irrational. To them it was reassurance in a place where the line between life and death was thinner than the ice itself. Scholars remain divided on whether these shelters were wise or reckless. Some argue that people exaggerated, that few would dare risk sleeping above water in the heart of winter. Others insist the practice was not only real but frequent, citing repeated mentions in chronicles and sagas. The truth may lie in the middle. Desperate people do desperate things, and desperation is exactly what blizzards create. You stand in the imagined shelter. Branches creak overhead as the wind shoves them sideways. Sparks from a fire drift upward before hissing out on the cold air. Men wrap cloaks tight, backs pressed together, boots braced against the ice. Horses snort nervously, hooves clattering on the slick floor. The soundscape is eerie. Fire crackling, animals shifting, ice groaning beneath, and beyond it all, the roar of the blizzard. You realize such a night would not be sleep but a vigil, every sound a warning. There's an odd anecdote preserved in a 14th century chronicle. A group of soldiers, encamped on a frozen river in Livonia, awoke to find themselves drifting downstream. The ice had fractured silently, carrying them like an enormous raft. They scrambled ashore half frozen, their makeshift shelters collapsing behind them. Whether the story is exaggerated or not, the image remains powerful nature reminding humans that it cannot be tamed. You press your palm against the ice again. The cold bites sharply, a reminder that beneath this fragile surface lies oblivion. Yet for medieval survivors, every patch of ground stone, snow or ice was a possible refuge. If the blizzard struck in the wrong place, they had to trust whatever surface they stood on. The smell of smoke lingers in your imagination, mingling with the brine of frozen water. You picture yourself lying on straw spread across the ice, cloak wrapped tight, body trembling as you listen for cracks in the night. Every shift, every pop would jolt you awake. Sleep would be shallow, broken, haunted by the thought of the river reclaiming its surface. And yet, if you survived till morning, you would rise to see the sun glittering across the frozen plain, proof that the gamble had paid off. You step carefully back toward the bank, snow crunching atop the ice. Behind you, the imagined shelter fades into storm, a ghost of survival strategies half remembered in chronicles and sagas. Ahead, the land rises again, rough and snow-burdened. You realize that for medieval people, every landscape offered both threat and possibility. Even a frozen river could become a roof, however briefly, if you dared to trust its silence. And so you walk on, carrying the memory of firelight flickering on black ice, a reminder that survival sometimes demanded the courage to sleep above water, suspended between storm and current. The storm still claws at you, but after the river's eerie groans you find yourself grateful for solid ground again. Your path takes you along a ridgeline where the wind howls with merciless force, tearing at your cloak until it flaps like a torn sail. You lower your head, shielding your eyes, and then you notice something remarkable. A line of woven panels staked into the earth, bending under the blizzard yet holding firm. These are hurdles, portable fences of interlaced wood, and in medieval winters they were more than barriers for sheep. They were life-saving windbreaks. Imagine a shepherd caught on the moors with his flock, night descending fast. He had no time to build a cottage or a pit, but he carried hurdles lashed to his pack or sled. He planted them in the snow, angled against the prevailing wind, and huddled behind. The effect was immediate. The gale broke, diverted upward and around, leaving a pocket of calmer air. With enough hurdles set in a row, a small camp could be made in minutes, just enough to keep humans and beasts from being stripped bare by the storm. Estate records from parts of Wales and Scotland mention shepherds loaned sets of hurdles for winter pastures, not only for corralling animals, but for creating these makeshift shelters. The documents don't wax poetic, they simply note fines for lost panels or payments for repairs, but their existence speaks volumes. It tells us that woven wood was not only about boundaries, it was about endurance. You step closer, brushing frost from the interlaced pattern. Willow branches, pliant and tough, are woven between upright stakes. Even frozen, they flex slightly in the wind, creaking but not snapping. You imagine the sound at night, a rhythmic groan, wood bowing but refusing to break, like a lullaby carved from labor. The smell of damp willow drifts faintly, earthy and bitter, mingling with snow's sharpness. One traveller's diary from the 14th century describes a shepherd in the Pennines who built a triangular hurdle house, leaning 3 panels together and throwing a hide over the top. He lit a tiny fire inside, the smoke curling through gaps, and slept warm enough to survive until dawn. Was it comfortable? Hardly. The diary admits the man's hair stank of smoke for weeks. But in the desperate calculus of a blizzard, survival trumped scent. Historians are divided on whether such structures were widespread or rare improvisations. Some argue that hurdles were too valuable as fencing to risk in storms. Others counter that their portability made them ideal emergency shelters. The lack of physical remains leaves only speculation. Yet the consistency of written references, shepherds, travelers, even soldiers caught in winter camps, suggests they were indeed a common fallback. You kneel behind one of the panels. The difference is immediate. The roar of the storm dulls, the force of the wind slackens. Snow still swirls, but you feel less exposed, less hunted. It is astonishing how a few rods of woven wood can change the atmosphere. Behind you, the ground is calmer, already forming a drift that rises like a second wall. You can imagine medieval wanderers sighing in relief, pressing their backs to the hurdles, finally able to breathe without choking on snow. Curiously, some folk traditions treated hurdles almost as charms. In rural Ireland, it was said that if you wove a hurdle on St. Brigid's Day and kept it through winter, no storm would harm your animals. Farmers carried miniature woven crosses as tokens, believing they embodied the same protective force as the full-sized panels. Perhaps the repetitive, ordered pattern of weaving symbolized resilience, the idea that chaos could be held at bay by human hands. The hurdles creak louder, bending under the storm. You picture yourself curling beneath a hide stretched across them, the flicker of fire casting shadows through the lattice. The smell of smoke, damp hide, and singed willow fills your lungs. Above, the wind moaned like a distant organ, but here you are shielded. Not warm, not comfortable, but shielded. Sometimes that was all medieval people asked for. A pause in the storm's fury, a pocket of endurance carved out by wood and will. Your mind drifts to a peculiar account from a French military campaign, where soldiers were said to have dismantled field fences and turned them into shelters during a snowbound siege. The chronicler scoffed, describing them as kennels fit for dogs, yet those makeshift kennels likely saved more lives than noble tents. Again and again, you see the same truth. Humility kept you alive. Pride could freeze you stiff. As you rise, brushing snow from your cloak, you take one last look at the wavering hurdles. They are unimpressive to the eye, simple weaves of wood, and yet they hold a quiet dignity, a reminder that survival often relies on the simplest, most portable of crafts. The shepherd's skill in weaving could mean the difference between dawn and death. And as the storm presses on, you realize you've just stood in the shadow of one of history's humblest, yet most faithful shelters. The farther you go, the more the storm presses down, relentless as a grinding mill. Snow lashes sideways, biting into your skin, and your breath feels like shards of glass in your lungs. You stagger toward a dim glow, a smear of orange flickering faintly through the white. At first, you think it's a lantern, but no, it is smoke rising from a low roof, seeping out through a hole that spits embers into the night. You've come across another type of medieval shelter, the smoky huts where fires burned at the center, but chimneys were rare, and the air grew thick enough to choke. Step inside and the world changes instantly. Warmth greets you first, not gentle but overwhelming, a wave of heat that makes your frozen cheeks sting. Then comes the sting of smoke in your eyes, acrid and suffocating. The room is dim, lit only by the hearth flame in the middle. Its glow dances across blackened beams above, where soot hangs in long stalactites of tar. The ceiling is low, the air dense. You cough, and the sound is swallowed by the haze. Accounts from manorial records and travellers' journals make it clear. In most peasant homes of the Middle Ages, chimneys were a rarity until the later centuries. Instead, smoke from the hearth simply drifted upward, finding its way through a hole in the thatch or cracks in the roof. Sometimes it lingered so heavily that beams dripped with creosote and eyes watered constantly. But this inconvenience was also a blessing. The smoke drove away insects, preserved meat hung in the rafters, and even added a layer of insulation by clogging gaps with soot. You sit by the fire, listening to the crackle of wood and the whistle of wind through the smoke hole. The warmth is immediate, a shock after the blizzard outside. Your toes tingle with the painful return of sensation, needles stabbing as blood flows again. You imagine medieval families clustered here, pressed close together, squinting against the haze yet grateful for every spark. Odd details survive in folklore. In parts of Scandinavia, people believed smoke itself carried prayers upward. A house without smoke was a house without life. Children were taught to read the curls of smoke. Thin wisps meant the fire was weak. Thick columns meant it would last. There are even superstitions warning against letting smoke drift westward, as it supposedly invited storms. Strange ideas, yet they reveal how central this smoky atmosphere was to daily survival. And still, historians argue about the true health effects. Some suggest constant smoke exposure led to chronic coughs, stinging eyes, and shortened lives. Others counter that peasants acclimated, lungs hardened, and the benefits outweighed the risks. Archaeological evidence of blackened beams in preserved cottages shows just how smoky those interiors were. Whether tolerable or torturous remains debated, but undeniable is this: people endured it because the alternative was freezing to death. You lie back on the hard floor, feeling the rushes beneath you crackle faintly. The smell is overwhelming: burnt wood, damp straw, sour sweat, but your body begins to relax despite it. The storm outside is distant now, muted to a dull growl. Inside, the hearth becomes the world. Children doze on their mothers' laps, elders mutter prayers, and someone stirs a pot of stew that smells faintly of turnips and onions. The smoke bites, but the food comforts. Survival often came in such mixtures of pain and relief. A traveller's note from 13th century Bohemia describes entering a hut where the smoke was so thick I thought myself blind, yet the warmth near slew me with comfort. That paradox captures it perfectly. You hated it, yet you needed it. Imagine entire winters spent in that twilight haze, eyes watering, hair and clothes infused with the scent of smoke. The very walls turned black, as if the storm outside had seeped in to live among them. There is something humbling about it. Here was no grandeur, no roaring hearth with carved mantel, no chimney drawing neatly upward, just fire, smoke, and survival. The family accepted stinging eyes and hacking coughs as the price for warmth. In the glow of those flames they wove baskets, mended tools, told stories, and waited for spring. Daily life continued under the haze, proving that endurance is not about comfort, it is about adapting to whatever keeps you alive. Your gaze drifts upward to the smoke hole. Snowflakes tumble in occasionally, hissing as they strike the coals. Each hiss reminds you that the storm is still raging, waiting just outside. Yet here, within walls blackened by years of soot, you are safe. You can almost feel the layers of time, Hundreds of winters lived beneath the same smoke-darkened beams, each generation coughing and blinking but alive. You close your eyes for a moment, breathing shallowly through the haze. The storm beyond howls, but here the fire whispers, its crackle a lullaby through the smoke. For all its sting, this hut feels like a heartbeat against the cold silence of the blizzard. And in that heartbeat, you understand why people endured the choking air, because it meant another dawn would come. The smoke clings to your cloak as you push back out into the blizzard, eyes stinging and lungs raw. Yet the warmth lingers, making the next rush of icy air feel like a slap. You stagger across the snowfield, vision blurred, until a glimmer of pale hide catches your eye. Stretched between poles, layered thickly, it quivers under the weight of snow. As you draw closer, you realize this is another form of medieval ingenuity. Walls of animal skins pulled tight and lashed together, sealing out the storm. In regions where timber was scarce or walls too fragile, people turned to hides. Oxen, reindeer, goats, even dogs in the far north all provided not only food and clothing but building material. A frame of wood or bone could be wrapped in hides, hair side outward, forming a crude but effective shield against wind. Historical records from northern Russia and the Scandinavian Sami describe such shelters, their interiors dark, pungent, and surprisingly warm. The hides stiffened in the frost, rattling like drumskins when the wind pressed against them, but they kept snow and sleet at bay. You run your gloved hand over the frozen surface. It is rough and ridged, smelling faintly of musk even beneath the snow. The touch transports you into a peasant's world. The slaughtered ox not only provided meat for winter stew, but also the very wall against which the family leaned that night. Nothing was wasted. Everything was survival. Inside the hide-covered shelter, the atmosphere changes. The space is dim, lit only by a small fire whose smoke sneaks through a vent cut high above. The walls are translucent where the hide has been scraped thin, glowing faintly in the firelight, like parchment stretched in a lantern. The smell is unmistakable, wet fur and smoke, mingled into a pungent reminder of necessity. Travelers' accounts reveal fascinating details. A 13th century missionary in Lapland noted that reindeer hide tents kept their warmth so well that ice melted on the ground inside, leaving pools of water. To counter this, people laid down branches, moss, or woven mats before settling in. The trick was to stay off the frozen earth as much as possible, layering beneath as well as above. Curiously, some cultures even rubbed hides with fish oil or tallow before stretching them, making them more water-resistant. The result smelled horrid, but it sealed out drafts and sleet. Imagine lying in that dim shelter, every breath filled with the tang of oil and smoke, every surface sticky, but knowing the storm could not pierce those greasy walls. Scholars still disagree about how widespread hide shelters were in Central Europe. Some argue they were rare, limited to nomadic groups and hunters far north. Others point to scattered references suggesting that even in more temperate regions, hides served as emergency insulation, hung over broken roofs or draped across doorways to keep out howling wind. The lack of archaeological traces leaves the argument unresolved, though the logic of the practice is clear. You crouch closer to the fire, feeling heat radiate from embers onto your chilled skin. Outside, the storm rages, pressing against the hide walls, making them bulge and tremble. Each gust sounds like a drumbeat, the shelter pulsing in rhythm with the wind. You imagine children curled up beneath thick blankets, listening to that strange music, soothed into sleep by the steady thrum of the storm on their hide-built walls. There is a curious note in folklore. Some believed animal spirits lingered in the hides, continuing to protect the people who slept beneath them. A family resting under ox-hide walls might whisper thanks to the animal, treating it as a guardian. Whether superstition or not, the practice reflects the intimacy of the relationship life quite literally wrapped in the remains of another life. You shift on the floor, straw crunching beneath you, and notice how the warmth gathers quickly in the confined space. Breath steams heavily, hanging in the air. The walls sweat faintly, droplets sliding down the stretched hide. It is clammy, unpleasant, but survivable. This paradox keeps repeating itself. Discomfort, accepted as the price of existence. A 14th century hunting manual even suggested carrying a rolled hide when traveling to be stretched into a quick shelter at night. Imagine knights, better fed and armored than peasants, still resorting to the same tricks as shepherds. Under a blizzard, all stations of life leveled out. The storm did not respect rank, it respected only those who adapted. Your senses absorb every detail: the sour odor of damp fur, the faint crackle of firewood, the rattle of hide trembling under wind's assault. Outside, death prowls in white silence. Inside, survival breathes in smoke and musk. You sit still, realizing how many winters were endured this way, bodies warmed by walls stitched from beasts they once tended. As your eyes close briefly, you can almost feel the shelter rocking with the gusts, a cradle woven from necessity. In the end, medieval survivors knew what you now understand. Warmth does not always come from comfort, but from ingenuity, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to live until morning. The hides still cling to your clothes as you stumble back into the blizzard. The air bites like knives again, and you cough against the cold, smoke still lingering in your throat. Snow swirls thick enough to blot out the horizon. Yet even as you press forward, you notice strange signs etched in the white patterns of ash scattered at doorways, salt sprinkled across thresholds, and odd markings scratched into wood. It dawns on you that not all medieval shelter was physical. Sometimes survival came wrapped in ritual, in beliefs meant to keep frost and darkness at bay. Walk into a village caught in the grip of winter, and you'd hear chants murmured over fires, charms nailed to beams, and whispered invocations at the start of every storm. Parish records from Germany mention priests blessing cottages before snow fell, using holy water to bind the cold at the doors. Families kept sprigs of evergreen above rafters, convinced they carried warmth from the last summer Sunday. And when walls failed, superstition took over, filling the gaps that stone and straw could not seal. You step through the door of one such hut. The air is thick, with the smell of burning herbs, juniper and sage, their smoke curling along the ceiling like phantom hands. A woman crouches by the hearth, murmuring prayers as she scatters salt into the flames. The sparks leap higher, snapping as if the salt itself has teeth. This was not just cooking or heating, it was an act of defense. To them, storms were not only weather, but forces with intention, spirits hungry to claim the living. Travel diaries note curious customs. In Scandinavia, people sometimes poured melted butter onto the doorstep during blizzards, offering it to spirits of the wind in exchange for mercy. In the Alps, children were told to beat on pots and pans during the first snow, frightening away demons that rode the storm. These gestures might seem fanciful to modern ears, but in the medieval imagination, they created a shelter as real as any wall. And yet scholars remain divided on how much weight such rituals truly carried in daily life. Some argue they were mere folklore, performed lightly, almost as play. Others insist they were central, binding communities together in belief when physical defenses faltered. With little hard evidence, the debate continues. But here, crouched in the flicker of a fire, while salt hisses in the flames, you can understand why ritual mattered. It gave people a sense of agency when storms stripped every other control away. You inhale the scent of juniper, sharp and resinous. It prickles your nose, mingling with the damp smell of hides and straw. The children in the hut sit silently, eyes wide, listening to the crackle. Their father mutters a charm taught by his grandfather, words older than the house itself. The storm rattles the shutters, snow squealing against wood, but the family draws strength from the rhythm of the prayer. For them, Warmth is not only fire, it is faith layered over fear. One peculiar tidbit appears in an English collection of folk remedies. People were told to keep an iron key beneath the hearthstone to lock winter away. Others tied red threads around the bedposts, symbols of protection against frostbite. Whether these gestures had physical effect did not matter. They offered calm in a season that thrived on panic. You lean closer to the fire. The herbs spit and pop, releasing an oily smoke that clings to your skin. For a moment, the air grows so thick it feels like another wall, an invisible barrier between you and the white fury outside. You realize how powerful this illusion must have been. A blizzard is overwhelming, endless. But with ritual, the storm becomes something you can bargain with, resist, even outwit. The family settles, shoulders touching, their breath mingling in the dim air. The children drift toward sleep, lulled not just by heat but by the assurance that they are protected by unseen guardians. Outside, the wind howls, but in their minds, it is no longer invincible. They have marked their doors, blessed their fire, spoken their charms. Survival is no longer just about stone or hide, it is about conviction. And as you step back into the snow, herbs still stinging your throat, you realize the truth. In medieval winters, the line between superstition and shelter was thin indeed. Sometimes a wall of belief held back despair more firmly than any wall of clay or stone. The wind lashes harder as you leave the smoke-scented cottage behind. Snow drives against your face like thrown sand, the world reduced to white chaos. Yet through the blur you spot darker shapes on the horizon low, rounded forms clustered together, each one glowing faintly with firelight inside. As you approach, you realize these are hide tents, stretched taut over frames, belonging to nomadic people who moved with the seasons. In the far north, reindeer herders and other tribes perfected this art of temporary shelter, and in medieval times their methods were astonishingly resilient. The frame rises first, long poles planted in a circle, gathered at the top in a cone. Over this skeleton, thick hides are laid, stitched together with sinew and lashed down with cords. Sometimes bark stripped or woven mats filled gaps. The result looks fragile to the outsider, just fabric over wood. But step inside, and you find a space of warmth, darkness, and community. Contemporary accounts from travelers in Lapland and Siberia describe entering such tents during storms, where the air was thick with heat from fires, reindeer breath, and steaming pots of broth. For the weary traveler, it was like stepping into another world entirely. You brush your way through the flap of one such shelter. The air shifts at once. The blizzard outside fades to a dull moan, and warmth strikes you like a tide. A fire pit glows in the center, its smoke funneling upward through a hole in the top. The hides ripple faintly with each gust, their seams creaking but holding. Around the fire, families sit cross-legged on furs, children playing with carved bone toys, elders murmuring stories while tending the flames. The smell is a rich mixture: wood smoke, boiled meat, damp leather, and the sharp tang of reindeer hides. One curious observation from a 16th century missionary notes that the smoke hole could be adjusted with flaps, acting like a primitive chimney. He marveled that the interior, though dark and close, was warm enough to make him shed his outer cloak. This detail proves how sophisticated these portable homes were, not crude improvisations but carefully refined designs suited for centuries of survival. Debate among historians continues about how much influence nomadic architecture had on settled medieval communities. Some argue that peasants in northern Europe borrowed ideas such as adjustable vents or layered hides from these nomads. Others insist the designs remained largely separate, each culture solving its own challenges independently. The lack of written records from the tribes themselves leaves the answer elusive, but the similarities are striking. You sit near the fire, feeling your frozen limbs thaw. The soundscape is intimate: the crackle of flames, the hiss of melting snow dripping from hides, the steady breath of reindeer tethered just outside. Someone ladles broth into a wooden bowl and passes it to you. The steam fogs your vision, carrying the scent of fat and marrow. Each sip spreads warmth through your chest, pushing the cold farther away. Folklore preserved strange beliefs about these tents. Some said the hides retained the spirit of the animals, protecting those inside. Others claimed the circular frame echoed the shape of the sky, making the shelter a mirror of the cosmos. To sleep inside was to align yourself with the universe, safe in its order. Whether symbolic or not, the design worked. Families endured storms that would have killed the unprepared. You glance upward through the smoke hole. Snowflakes tumble in, glowing as they catch the firelight before vanishing into steam. The hides rustle, cords groaning under tension, but the structure holds. The storm can rage outside as much as it likes. Inside, life continues, children giggling, pots bubbling, elders humming half-remembered songs. A traveller once remarked that he found it odd how quickly such shelters could vanish. At dawn, families dismantled the poles, rolled the hides, and loaded them onto sleds. Within an hour the camp was gone, leaving only faint circles in the snow. That portability was its genius. Homes that moved as herds moved, homes that bent with storms instead of breaking. You lean back against a folded fur, body finally relaxed, and marvel at the ingenuity. Here, shelter is not stone or timber, but flexibility. It is proof that survival in a medieval blizzard was not about resisting nature at all costs, but about learning to sway with it. The hides ripple in time with the wind, and you understand. This house breathes with the storm, and because it breathes, it endures. The storm drives you farther into the highlands, where the air feels sharper and thinner. Snow clings to every ledge, sculpted into drifts by winds that whistle like flutes across the peaks. Your path winds toward a cluster of stone buildings perched against the mountainside. Their walls are thick, their windows narrow slits, and a bell tower looms faintly above the storm. You've reached a cloister, one of the fortified monasteries where medieval monks built sanctuaries that became havens not only for prayer but for survival. Step inside the cloister's gate, and the difference is immediate. The outer walls block the gale, muffling the storm to a steady moan. Within the courtyard, snow lies deep but calm. Lanterns flicker against cloister arches, casting warm pools of light across flagstones. Monks in woolen habits shuffle silently, their breath clouds rising in unison as they cross from chapel to dormitory. These walls are more than stone. They are bulwarks against both storm and despair. Medieval monastic records confirm that mountain cloisters were deliberately built with walls several feet thick, packed with rubble and lime mortar. The result was insulation almost as effective as modern stone houses. Inside, temperatures remained steady even in the worst winters. Monks also dug storerooms deep into the rock, filling them with salted fish, smoked meat, and casks of ale to last through months of snowbound isolation. These details come alive in surviving account books, which carefully list every barrel and loaf rationed during storms. You pass into the refectory, the communal dining hall. The air is warm, filled with the scent of stewing lentils and baking bread. A long fire pit burns down the center, its smoke funneling upward through a stone vent. Benches line either side, worn smooth by centuries of use. The monks eat in silence, heads bowed, steam rising from their bowls. Outside the storm rages, but here discipline and design make survival calm and almost orderly. One curious practice described in a 14th century rulebook. Monks would sleep in communal dormitories, their beds lined in rows, with only thin partitions. This wasn't just for spiritual humility. Body heat shared across dozens of men created a microclimate that softened the bitter chill. Imagine the sound of soft snores, the rustle of straw mattresses, and the faint drip of melting snow from roof tiles. To an outsider it might seem austere, but to those inside, it was efficient warmth. Scholars debate the extent to which monasteries served as refuges for surrounding villagers during storms. Some argue they were open sanctuaries, offering shelter to travelers and peasants when blizzards trapped them. Others contend the cloisters were insular, built to protect monks alone, with outsiders rarely admitted. The truth may have varied by region and order. Still, stories survive of desperate shepherds pounding on abbey doors in the snow, monks lifting them inside, wrapping them in cloaks, and sharing bread by the fire. You find yourself in the scriptorium, where monks copy manuscripts by candlelight. The smell of wax and parchment fills the room. Windows are shuttered against the wind, yet a faint draught flickers the flames. One monk dips his quill into ink, his hand steady despite the cold. He writes words of theology, but perhaps also notes of weather, recording the fury of storms so future generations would remember. These fragile pages, now preserved in libraries, carry echoes of the very winters you imagine. A peculiar tidbit emerges from monastic annals. Some cloisters kept beehives even in snowy climates, storing them in stone shelters where bees hibernated. The honey was not only food but medicine, spread on wounds and mixed into hot drinks for warmth. To picture bees sleeping behind thick walls while monks prayed nearby is to glimpse how every detail of life was organized for survival. The soundscape here is different from peasant huts or hide tents. Instead of coughing children and creaking beams, you hear the steady rhythm of chanting. From the chapel comes a low drone of voices, Latin hymns rising and falling like waves. The storm outside is muffled by stone, but within, the chant swells, filling the air with calm. For the monks, prayer itself was a shelter, something that wrapped the soul as stone wrapped the body. You sit near the chapel's brazier, watching sparks dance upward. The floor is cold beneath you, yet the stillness seeps into your bones, a different kind of warmth. You imagine a winter night when villagers, shepherds, and monks all knelt together, listening to the chant while snow piled higher against the cloister walls. In that harmony, survival became more than physical, it became communal. The storm beats on the mountain still, snow drumming against shutters, wind rattling the bell tower. But inside these thick-walled sanctuaries, humanity has carved out a rhythm of endurance. Food carefully stored, fires tended, bodies warmed by one another, and voices raised in prayer. It is a reminder that shelter can be stone and mortar, yes, but it can also be ritual, order, and shared resilience. The bells of the cloister fade into the storm behind you as you press onward into the mountains. The path narrows, hemmed in by cliffs, and snow cascades down the slopes in sudden bursts. You begin to notice strange formations. Long slopes of whiteness poised high above, hanging in silence until the wind shakes them loose. Avalanches? Even the strongest shelter means nothing if placed in their shadow. In medieval times, people often built huts, barns, or even chapels in valleys without realizing they were directly in the path of sliding snow. Chronicles from the Swiss Alps record entire hamlets swallowed in minutes, wooden beams splintered, families buried under tons of ice. One 14th century chronicle describes a white wave that came without water, erasing every sound but its roar. Survivors rebuilt, only to face the same fate years later. Geography was not always kind to human judgment. You pause, scanning the slopes above. The silence is unnerving, almost heavier than the wind. Snow creaks faintly, shifting. You realize how precarious it is to rest here, how every crack of ice feels like a warning. To medieval villagers, these landslide zones were mysteries. Some said avalanches were the wrath of spirits disturbed by shouting or laughter. To this day, alpine folklore warns against loud voices in the mountains during winter. The belief may have been superstition, but it echoes a kernel of truth. Noise and vibration can indeed trigger slides. Inside a mountain hut, the danger was constant. Imagine huddling with family around a fire, hearing the deep rumble approach. The walls shake, the roof groans, and within seconds snow slams down with unstoppable force. Archaeological digs in alpine valleys have uncovered collapsed structures preserved beneath old avalanche layers, their timbers twisted, hearthstones cracked. These remains testify that some storms were not survivable, no matter how carefully people built. Yet people adapted. Records from Tyrol describe villagers constructing avalanche barriers, lines of wooden fences or stone walls erected upslope to break the snow's momentum. These were primitive predecessors of the barriers still seen today. Whether they worked perfectly is uncertain, but the very act of building them shows how aware medieval communities were of the peril looming above. Curiously, one traveller's journal from the early 15th century recounts that monks in certain alpine monasteries rang bells during heavy snow, believing the vibrations would either ward off avalanches or, paradoxically, bring them down early before they grew larger. Historians debate whether this was effective or foolish. Bells may not have moved mountains, but the sound gave villagers a sense of preparedness, a signal that danger was near and they must keep watch. You imagine yourself in such a hut now, snow piled high against the walls, the fire flickering low. Outside, the mountain groans. The air inside is thick with tension. No one speaks above a whisper. Every crack in the ice overhead feels magnified, every gust of wind like a threat. Children cling to their mothers. Fathers grip tools useless against the weight of 1,000 tons of snow. In such moments, shelter becomes a paradox, strong enough to shield you from wind and cold, but fragile against the mountain itself. A peculiar tidbit from local lore tells of villagers planting fir trees in deliberate rows upslope from their huts, believing the roots would hold the snow in place. Whether botanical strategy or superstition, it shows the lengths to which people went to shape the land for survival. Some of those tree belts still exist, silent guardians grown from medieval fear. The atmosphere here is stark. Unlike the smoky huts or animal-filled byres, avalanche country shelters were marked by an underlying dread. You can almost smell it sweat sharp with anxiety, mingled with the usual odors of smoke and straw. Conversations were hushed, movements careful, as though even laughter might provoke disaster. You crouch beneath a wooden beam, listening. The hut creaks. Outside, snow hisses down the slope in a small slide, harmless this time. But the sound lingers in your ears, a reminder of fragility. For medieval people, surviving a blizzard was never just about cold, it was about choosing where to place your home, where to rest your weary body, where to risk the night. And yet, people stayed. They rebuilt huts crushed by avalanches, re-roofed barns, raised walls again and again. Why? Because land was precious, grazing grounds were limited, and families had little choice. Storms might take everything, but abandoning the mountain was unthinkable. Their stubbornness became a form of shelter too, invisible yet unbreakable. As you leave the hut and trudge farther down the valley, you carry that thought with you. Survival sometimes meant living knowingly in danger's shadow, trusting that tomorrow's dawn would still arrive. The blizzard rages on, but the memory of those who built beneath avalanches lingers quiet, resolute, and terribly human. The valley narrows until the mountains press in on either side, and you find yourself drawn toward a cluster of wooden structures clinging to the slope. Their walls are sturdy but plain, their roofs pitched steep to shed snow. Inside, the air is heavy with the smell of smoke and livestock. Yet what captures your attention most is not the architecture, but the way people sleep here raised above the floor on wooden platforms. It is a simple adjustment, but one that made all the difference when cold stone threatened to leach the warmth from their bones. Medieval sources occasionally mention these platforms. In Northern Europe they were called sengebank, or sleeping benches, and they appear in both sagas and household records. Archaeological remains of longhouses in Norway show stone hearths with wooden ledges built nearby, suggesting that families lay upon them at night, lifted above the damp and draughty ground. Even in peasant huts, beds or bunks were often raised on crude frames, with straw piled thick for insulation. It was not luxury, but pragmatism. Cold sinks low, and heat rises. Climbing just a few feet, Sleepers escape the worst of the chill. You step onto one of the platforms. The wood creaks beneath your weight, polished smooth by countless bodies before you. The straw mattress rustles, releasing a faint, grassy scent even in winter. You stretch out and immediately feel the difference. Air is warmer up here. Smoke from the hearth drifts across your face, and the stone chill from the floor fades into memory. It is still cold. Your breath fogs before your lips, but it is survivable. Written accounts describe how entire families slept together on these raised beds. Parents, children, even grandparents pressed shoulder to shoulder, their combined heat forming a barrier against frost. Sometimes livestock nestled below, their warmth rising to meet the humans above. It is easy to imagine the scene, a room alive with quiet breathing, the occasional cough or murmur, the glow of embers casting red shadows on the ceiling beams. Privacy was impossible, but safety outweighed modesty. One curious note comes from a 15th century inventory in Denmark, which lists carved wooden bed boxes with sliding doors. These were essentially small wooden chambers where sleepers enclosed themselves like nesting dolls, trapping warmth inside. Folklore suggests people even believed the closed beds kept away evil spirits, as if the wood formed not just a shield against drafts, but against nightmares themselves. The design spread slowly, and a few examples survive in museums today, dark and worn from centuries of use. Scholars debate how widespread these sleeping platforms truly were. Some argue they were luxuries of wealthier peasants, while others maintain they were common in cold regions, built with whatever timber was available. The truth may depend on geography. In the Alps and Scandinavia, the archaeological record is clearer, while in England or France, evidence is thinner. Yet the principle is universal. Humans everywhere realize that warmth could be stolen back by sleeping high. You roll onto your side, feeling the straw prick your skin through your cloak. The smell is pungent, earthy, and faintly sour, but it is also comforting. Beneath the bed, the floor lies dark and cold, a reminder of what you've escaped. Above you, the smoke drifts lazily, settling in thick beams where it blackens the rafters. This is not comfort in the modern sense, but it is protection, and protection is all you crave. A quirky anecdote from Icelandic sagas mentions warriors sharing sleeping benches so tightly that their beards froze together by morning. The image makes you smile despite the storm. A row of grizzled men waking in confusion, tugging at one another's faces to break free. Humorous, yes, but it illustrates the intimacy of survival. The storm stripped away distance. In those huts, bodies became the insulation, closeness the weapon against the cold. You listen to the imagined sounds, the creak of wood as sleepers shift, the hiss of wind beyond the walls, the occasional thud of snow sliding from the roof. The fire crackles low, its light dimming, but the bed still holds warmth. Children whimper softly, soothed by a mother's hand. An old man mutters prayers into the darkness. The rhythm of survival hums quietly, steady as breath. It strikes you that the raised bed is more than furniture. It is a philosophy, an acknowledgement that survival lies not in conquering the storm but in small adjustments. A foot higher, a wall thicker, a bed shared closer. The medieval world was not rich in resources, but it was rich in ingenuity. These simple platforms are proof. Outside, the blizzard roars on, indifferent, but here, on this creaking wooden bench, you feel a fragile pocket of warmth, a defiance carved from timber and straw. And in that fragile pocket, you understand why medieval families endured. They didn't need grandeur. They needed only a place where cold could not quite reach. The wooden platform creaks as you rise, brushing straw from your cloak. Outside, the storm has eased slightly, though the wind still snakes through every gap, whistling like a restless ghost. You trudge across a courtyard piled with drifts until the smell of hay strikes you a sweet, musty perfume that cuts through the sharpness of the cold. The scent grows stronger as you pull open the door of a loft piled high with fodder. Inside, you discover another survival trick of the medieval world, burrowing into hay for warmth. At first glance, it seems laughably simple. Hay is for animals, not people. Yet for desperate villagers, farmers, and shepherds caught away from home, it became a blanket, a mattress, and sometimes the only thing that stood between life and frostbite. Parish accounts from England mention families forced to sleep in barns during particularly harsh winters, while travellers' notes from Scandinavia describe haylofts doubling as inns when storms cut off the road. Archaeological remains of barns from the 12th and 13th centuries even show ladders leading to raised lofts practical for storing fodder, but also perfect for tucking in weary bodies above the livestock. You climb the ladder, each rung stiff with frost, and plunge your hands into the hay. It prickles against your skin, sharp yet oddly inviting. The warmth is immediate. Insulation is hay's secret. The stalks trap air, slowing the loss of heat. Burrow into a heap, and soon your own body turns the space into a cocoon. Children knew this instinctively, burrowing like fox kits into mounds, giggling before sleep. For adults, it was less a game than a necessity, though they too felt the relief when the itch of stalks was outweighed by the blessing of warmth. One curious detail from folklore: it was said that hay stored from midsummer retained a fragment of the sun, and sleeping in it brought health. Farmers believed that newborn calves placed in the first cut of hay would thrive stronger, and people sometimes extended this belief to themselves, burrowing into sun-fed hay during the hardest nights. It may sound fanciful, but when you lie in the golden-smelling heap, you understand how convincing the illusion must have been. Of course, scholars disagree about how safe this practice was. Some point out that hay, when damp, could ferment and even smoulder, posing the risk of fire. Others argue that infestations of fleas or mites made haylofts breeding grounds for illness. The truth is likely both, uncomfortable and risky, but often better than the alternative of freezing outdoors. Survival rarely offered perfect options. You lie down now, pressing deeper into the pile. The hay scratches your face, pokes through your cloak, and leaves tiny cuts on your wrists. Yet warmth blossoms around you. The smell is overwhelming: dry grass, dust, and the faint musk of animals below. You can hear them shifting, their hooves clattering, their breath rising in warm clouds. The combination of livestock heat and hay insulation creates a bubble of life in the middle of the storm. There's an odd little anecdote from a 14th century French village. A family trapped in a barn during a 3-day blizzard sang songs each night while buried in the hay, their voices muffled but cheerful. When finally dug out, neighbors said it sounded as if the barn itself had been singing. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential. Haylofts became places not just of warmth but of camaraderie, where stories and songs warded off despair as effectively as the stalks warded off frost. The soundscape here is gentler than in other shelters. Instead of wind screaming or hides rattling, you hear the steady rustle of hay as bodies shift, the occasional snort of cattle below, and the soft drip of melted snow leaking through roof beams. The loft feels like a nest, rough but protective. You imagine children giggling as they tumble into the hay, the itching forgotten in the delight of play. Their parents lie nearby, exhausted, yet relieved to feel warmth seeping back into their bones. The storm outside may rage, but inside this loft the family survives, huddled among the same fodder that will feed their animals through the season. Human and beast both depend on these golden stalks, a reminder that in medieval winters, boundaries blurred, and resources were shared in whatever way ensured endurance. As you shift deeper, dust rises in your nose, making you sneeze. The sneeze echoes faintly in the wooden loft, then is swallowed by the storm's muted roar. You cough, laugh quietly at yourself, and then settle again, marveling that something so humble as dried grass could be the difference between life and death. The hay rustles like a lullaby as you close your eyes. Above, snow patters against the roof, but here inside your fragrant cocoon, you understand what countless peasants, shepherds, and travelers discovered. Warmth sometimes lies in the simplest, scratchiest places. You cough as you crawl out of the hayloft, dust still clinging to your nose and straw scratching your wrists. The storm greets you again with its icy slap, snow swirling so thickly that the world seems carved from chalk. You pull your cloak tighter and stumble onward, boots sinking into drifts that swallow your legs. Soon you notice something peculiar. A hut half buried, its door completely sealed by snow and ice. The wooden frame is visible, but the entrance is nothing more than a white wall. In that moment you realize another danger medieval people faced being snowed in so completely that their shelters became prisons. Written records from alpine villages and northern plains describe winters so severe that doors froze shut overnight. Families woke to find themselves trapped, their homes entombed. Some resorted to digging tunnels out of loft windows. Others waited until neighbors came with shovels. In one 15th century account from Austria, a parish priest wrote of visiting cottages where people had not emerged for weeks, relying on stored food and the body heat of livestock until the thaw. To survive inside was possible but claustrophobic. You brush snow away from the doorway. The ice is solid, like stone. With effort you pry it aside, squeezing through a narrow gap. Inside, the air is thick and still. The room is dark, the only light a faint glow from embers smouldering in the hearth. The family within startles at your entrance. Their faces are pale, their eyes tired, but they are alive. The door may be sealed, yet their little world persists. The first thing you notice is the smell. Heavy, stale, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and damp wool. With no fresh air, the atmosphere feels almost suffocating. Yet there is warmth. The packed snow on the walls acts as insulation, keeping the bitter wind at bay. It is like being buried alive in a cave, but a cave that preserves life. Travelers' tales reveal that villagers sometimes welcomed this accidental insulation. Once doors were sealed, they knew no draught could enter. Families huddled close, rationing food, and treated the snow as their ally. Still, the risk was real. Fires consumed oxygen quickly, so flames were kept small or extinguished entirely. In place of firelight, candles sputtered, casting thin shadows across soot-dark walls. The silence was broken only by coughing, whispering, and the occasional creak of the roof under snow's weight. One curious superstition held that if you marked the sealed door with a cross made of soot, the snow would forget to press any harder. Whether protective charm or psychological comfort, the ritual hints at the desperation of people sealed inside their own shelters. Children were told not to cry too loudly, lest the storm hear and bury them deeper. Scholars today discuss whether these snow prison winters were exaggerated in chronicles, or whether entire villages truly vanished under drifts. Archaeological traces are difficult to prove, yet written records repeat the theme often enough to suggest a kernel of truth. Perhaps not every year, but in the worst winters, households did indeed spend weeks without stepping outside. You sit on a low bench, feeling the strange weight of silence. The family stirs around you, moving sluggishly. They wear layer upon layer of wool, cloaks stiff with frost at the edges. A girl pokes the fire with a stick, coaxing a few sparks. Her hands are red, chapped raw. A boy gnaws on a crust of bread so hard it cracks like stone. Their mother ladles thin broth into wooden bowls, its steam filling the air with the scent of cabbage. There is no joy here, only routine, the monotony of endurance. Yet there are also traces of adaptation. On the table lies a small clay lamp, its wick soaked in animal fat, giving faint light without consuming precious oxygen. In the corner, dried herbs hang, both for food and for the belief that their scent kept sickness away. And above the hearth, strips of meat dry slowly, preserved in the smoke. It is a world reduced to essentials: breath, warmth, food. A peculiar anecdote survives in a Swiss folk tale. During one long winter, a family trapped inside sang hymns daily to teach the snow patience. Neighbors who dug them out weeks later swore the hymns echoed faintly from the frozen drifts. Whether true or not, The story captures the psychological power of ritual when walls of snow press down. You close your eyes and imagine the feeling of being sealed inside for days, weeks. No horizon, no sky, only the faint glow of a fire. The storm might rage for hours, or it might already be calm, you would not know. The world shrinks to a single room, and time blurs. Perhaps this confinement explains why storytelling, song, and prayer flourished in such seasons. Without them, madness might creep in faster than frost. At last you push your way back out through the narrow gap, snow tumbling onto your shoulders. The air, bitter as it is, feels like freedom after the heavy stillness inside. You breathe deeply, coughing as the cold burns your lungs, but grateful for the vastness above. Behind you, the hut remains sealed, a small cocoon where life persists against crushing odds. And you realize something simple but profound. In medieval winters, survival was not always about breaking free from snow. Sometimes it was about surrendering to it, letting it cover you like a blanket, and trusting that spring would remember to come. You trudge on, boots crunching through the deepening snow, until the faint roar of waves reaches your ears. It surprises you the sea, here, in the middle of a blizzard. The air tastes different, briny and sharp, the scent of salt cutting through the frozen wind. Ahead, low huts rise from the shoreline, their frames rough, their walls patched with whatever driftwood the sea has surrendered. These are coastal shelters, born not of forests or fields, but of tides. For medieval fishing villages, driftwood was treasure. Timber was scarce along barren coasts, and storms often swept away what little could be harvested. But the sea itself offered its own supply: broken masts, splintered planks, and tree trunks carried by currents. Villagers gathered them eagerly, dragging each piece above the tide line to be dried and shaped into walls, roofs, and frames. Written accounts from Norse sagas and Anglo-Saxon chronicles alike mention driftwood huts and even boats pulled ashore and inverted to serve as shelters. The sea could wreck, but it also provided. You step closer to one such hut. Its walls are crooked, the wood warped by long months in salt water, but lashed firmly with rope and corked with moss. Seaweed still clings to the edges, stiff and brown. The roof sags under the weight of snow, yet it holds. Push the door open, and the smell floods over you: brine, fish, tar, and smoke. The interior is dark, lit by a single fire whose coals glow red. Nets hang drying overhead, stiff with frost. Bundles of reeds line the floor, serving as bedding. One unusual practice noted in coastal records was the mixing of seaweed into daub or thatch. It seems absurd, but kelp dried into surprisingly strong fibers, and its salt content deterred rot. In fact, archaeologists excavating old island huts have found layers of seaweed stuffed into walls as insulation. Imagine lying down to sleep, the pungent scent of kelp filling your nose, and believing that the very seaweed carried the ocean's stubborn endurance into your bones. Of course, historians debate how effective such materials truly were. Some argue driftwood was too brittle, seaweed too damp, and huts too porous to stand against severe winters. Others point to centuries of habitation in Shetland, Orkney, and Iceland as proof that these shelters worked, even if imperfectly. Perhaps it was less about perfection and more about persistence. Patch the wall, replace the plank, stuff in more moss, repeat until spring. You sit near the hearth, listening to the sounds inside. The sea roars faintly beyond the walls, blending with the storm's howl. The fire pops as brine-soaked logs burn with a hiss. The room smells of smoked fish, pungent but filling. A family shares the space. A fisherman mends his net, children curl beneath furs, and a woman stirs a pot of broth that smells faintly of herring. The atmosphere is close, humid with salt, but warm. Here, life persists at the very edge of land and sea. A curious anecdote survives from an Icelandic saga. One family supposedly built their winter hut entirely from the ribs of a whale that had washed ashore. The bones arched overhead like a cathedral, hides stretched between them. Whether myth or fact, the image captures the essence of coastal ingenuity. Anything that washed up became shelter. Shipwrecked timbers, whale bones, even piles of shells were repurposed into walls. When the storm bore down, these ocean gifts became bulwarks. You run your hand along the warped wood of the wall. It feels slick, salt still embedded in the grain. The rope lashings creak faintly as the wind pushes against them. Each sound reminds you that these huts were never permanent. They bent, they swayed, they failed, but they were rebuilt again and again. Resilience was not in the material, but in the will to keep lashing driftwood together, no matter how many storms had already taken it apart. The soundscape deepens. Gulls cry faintly, even in the storm, scavenging where they can. The waves thunder against the rocks, muffled by snow but insistent. Inside, the crackle of fire and the murmur of voices create a fragile cocoon. For a moment, you almost feel as if the sea itself has wrapped its arms around the hut, holding it steady through the blizzard. You imagine lying down on the reed mats, the smell of salt filling your lungs. The warmth from the fire mingles with the damp air, sticky and clinging. It is not comfort in any luxurious sense, but it is survivable. And survivable was all these coastal families asked for. As you step back outside, the blizzard lashes harder, but your mind lingers on the hut's crooked strength. Driftwood, seaweed, bones, rope, all of it scavenged, all of it transformed into walls against the storm. And you realize, for medieval people on the edges of the world, survival was less about building something perfect and more about using whatever washed ashore. In their hands, even wreckage became a refuge. The coastline fades behind you as you struggle inland once more. The storm thickens, a white curtain swallowing the road, until shapes loom suddenly out of the haze. Large, gabled buildings huddled together, light spilling through shuttered windows. You smell ale, wood smoke, and roasted meat drifting into the snow. Relief floods you as you realize you've reached one of the few true havens available to medieval travelers during blizzards: the hostel, the inn, the alehouse. Step inside, and the world changes instantly. Noise slams into you: laughter, shouting, the scrape of benches, the clatter of mugs. The warmth is almost overwhelming, sweat and smoke mingling in air thick enough to choke. But compared to the howling dark outside, it feels like paradise. In the Middle Ages, wayfarers relied heavily on such communal shelters. Monasteries offered hospitality too, but inns and taverns were the lifeblood of trade routes, river crossings, and market towns. Chronicles and guild records alike mention how travelers, merchants, and pilgrims crowded into them during storms, bedding down wherever space could be found. The floor is strewn with rushes, already damp with spilled ale. The fire roars in a central hearth, its smoke escaping fitfully through a vent above. The smell of roasting pork makes your stomach ache with sudden hunger. At a long table, men in woolen cloaks dice and gamble, their voices hoarse from shouting. A group of pilgrims huddle near the wall, rosaries in hand, their lips moving in prayer as they try to ignore the chaos. One detail from 14th century inn accounts shows how essential these shelters were. Innkeepers were fined if they refused travelers in dangerous weather. Hospitality was not just kindness but obligation, enforced by custom and sometimes law. In practice, this meant that a blizzard could double or triple the number of bodies in a hall. Straw mats laid edge to edge, strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder for warmth. You find a corner near the fire. The heat is intense, smoke curling into your eyes, but your frozen fingers tingle back to life. Around you, the room vibrates with sound: tankards clinking, dogs barking, children crying, the rhythmic beat of a lute played by a minstrel in the corner. The storm outside is muted now, only a faint rumble against the thick timber walls. Curious customs flourished in such places. Travelers often carved their marks into beams or door frames, leaving a record of their passage. Some inns even displayed antlers or ship timbers as charms against winter spirits. One English tale claims that hanging a horseshoe above the door kept blizzards from lingering. Whether superstition or clever advertisement, it reassured those inside that they were safe. Historians continue to debate how comfortable these hostels truly were. Some describe them as lively, warm refuges, bustling with cheer. Others paint them as filthy, smoky, and rife with fleas. Both images are probably true, depending on the inn and its keeper. Archaeological excavations of medieval taverns reveal layers of straw, broken pottery, and even gnawed bones, all signs of both sustenance and squalor. Survival was guaranteed, comfort optional. You glance around the hall. A merchant argues with the innkeeper over prices, voice rising above the din. A minstrel sings a bawdy ballad, drowned out by laughter. Near the door, a group of shepherds, snow still clinging to their cloaks, curl together on the floor, already snoring. The smell is thick ale, sweat, meat, smoke, and though unpleasant, it is alive. The storm may rage outside, but here humanity refuses to be silent. A curious anecdote from a 15th century French innkeeper's ledger notes an entry for 3 pennies for straw, 5 pennies for mending a bench broken by quarrel. It captures the essence of these places: messy, loud, often violent, but indispensable. People quarreled, drank too much, even fought, but they survived the night, and that was enough. You imagine lying down among the strangers, the rushes rustling under your cloak. Feet press against your side. Someone's elbow jabs you, but warmth builds in the press of bodies. The fire crackles low, casting shadows that dance across smoke-blackened beams. Somewhere above, snow thuds onto the roof, but the building holds, built with stout timbers designed to withstand centuries of weather. There's a peculiar comfort in the chaos. Unlike the silence of a snow cave or the stifling stillness of a sealed hut, here, the noise itself is reassurance. Every shout, every laugh, every snore is proof that life pushes back against the storm. You let the sounds wash over you, closing your eyes. Perhaps you'll sleep only lightly, stirred by quarrels or barking dogs, but at least you will sleep without fear of freezing. And as you drift toward rest, you realize why medieval inns and alehouses mattered so deeply. They were more than buildings. They were the collective hearth of the road, places where strangers became companions, where warmth was borrowed from fire and from one another. In a world ruled by storms, nothing was more powerful than a roof, a fire, and voices refusing to fall silent. The noise of the alehouse still lingers in your ears as you trudge back into the storm. Compared to the raucous warmth, the silence feels deafening, the snow swallowing every sound but your breath. Your path takes you uphill, and soon the outline of stone towers pierces the white haze. Massive walls loom above, black against the drifting snow, arrow slits glowing faintly with torchlight. You have reached a castle, one of the few places where shelter during winter storms became almost luxurious compared to the struggle of peasants. Inside the gates, the courtyard is busy despite the weather. Servants scurry with baskets of firewood, their cloaks whipped by the wind. Soldiers stamp their feet by the walls, breath puffing like steam. Horses neigh nervously in stables, their flanks steaming in the cold air. The storm rattles at the battlements, but the walls of stone are so thick that the castle itself seems indifferent. Step into the kitchens, and warmth slams into you like a tide. Fires roar in enormous hearths, spits creak as boars turn slowly, and the smell of roasting meat and spices fills the cavernous room. In castles, the kitchen was the beating heart during winter. While outer chambers might be freezing, the kitchen never lacked heat. Servants, cooks, and even guards often lingered there, soaking in warmth before braving colder halls. Archaeological remains of great kitchens in places like Durham and Coucy reveal hearths large enough to roast entire oxen, their soot-blackened chimneys towering high above. You stand near one such fire, the blaze so fierce it singes your cheeks. Sparks leap upward, dancing into the smoke hole. Copper pots hang from hooks, steam curling in fragrant clouds. The noise is constant, the clang of ladles, the hiss of fat, the chatter of cooks calling orders. This is not the hush of a peasant hut, it is organized chaos, yet comforting, a sign of abundance. Medieval chroniclers sometimes remarked with awe at castle kitchens in winter. One wrote that, "There men forget the storm, for the fire devours the wind." It was true. Step into these blazing halls, and the blizzard felt like a far-off nuisance rather than a direct threat. That contrast must have been astonishing for villagers who sometimes sought refuge within castle walls during sieges or storms. One curious tidbit emerges from household records. During especially harsh winters, castle kitchens were never allowed to go dark. Fires burned continuously, day and night, not only for cooking but to keep walls from freezing solid. This constant flame meant there was always warmth for those lucky enough to linger. Servants slept on benches, guards napped near the oven, and children curled in corners, lulled by the endless roar of the hearth. Still, scholars debate how warm castles truly were. Some argue that outside the kitchen and great hall, chambers were frigid, their stone walls leaching heat. Archaeological studies of medieval castles show fireplaces only in certain rooms, meaning most people still shivered under layers of wool and furs. Others suggest that tapestries, carpets, and cleverly placed braziers made interiors more comfortable than often assumed. The truth likely varied. Kitchens blazed, halls flickered with warmth, but draughty corridors remained cruelly cold. You wander into the great hall, vast and echoing. At one end a fire burns in an enormous hearth, logs crackling, their light illuminating banners overhead. Nobles sit at the high table, cloaked in velvet and fur, sipping hot spiced wine. Below them, servants bustle, and travellers lucky enough to find entry cluster near the flames. The air is alive with warmth and chatter, in stark contrast to the icy silence outside. It is here that survival feels not only secure but celebratory. Feast replaces famine, song replaces silence. Yet even in this grandeur, the truth remains. The storm rages just beyond the stone. Without these walls, without this fire, even lords would freeze. Castles remind you that privilege in the medieval world often meant insulation from nature, not escape from it. A peculiar account from a 13th century visitor to a Norman keep describes nobles carrying hand braziers, small pans of coals, as they moved from room to room. Imagine that. Aristocrats wrapped in furs, holding glowing bowls of fire like lanterns against draughts. It shows that even the mighty bent to winter's power, carrying flames as peasants carried cloaks. The soundscape here is grander than any peasant hut. Harps and lutes echo against stone walls, mingling with the deep crackle of the fire. The smell is richer too: roasted venison, cinnamon, cloves and wine. For you, half frozen, the abundance is almost overwhelming. Yet beneath the luxury lies the same truth you've seen in every shelter: fire, walls, closeness. The ingredients differ, but the formula is the same. As you sit near the hearth, warmth seeping into your limbs, you reflect on the contrasts. In barns, peasants burrow into hay. In huts, smoke chokes the air. In castles, servants bustle and nobles feast. Yet all are bound by the same storm, all dependent on the fragile miracle of warmth. You rise at last, stepping back into the snow-dimmed courtyard. The castle looms behind, its fires blazing, a fortress of stone against the storm. And you realize that in medieval winters, shelter was not only survival, it was hierarchy carved into architecture. For peasants, it was straw and smoke. For lords, it was stone and spice. But for both, it was the thin line that kept death outside the door. The castle walls fade into the storm as you march down a slope toward the valley floor. The blizzard claws at you again, furious at being ignored, and you stagger forward until the land flattens into marshy ground. Here the snow drifts differently, less like dunes, more like waves pressing against the reeds. Through the haze you glimpse shapes half buried in frost, earthen mounds, low and rounded, smoke seeping faintly from their tops. You have stumbled upon another form of shelter, one both ancient and enduring, the sod house. These structures, often found in regions short on timber, were crafted by stacking blocks of earth cut from grasslands. The roots held the soil together like bricks, and when layered thickly, they formed walls that resisted both wind and cold. Archaeological excavations in northern Europe reveal foundations of turf-built homes dating back centuries, their remnants still visible in Iceland and the Scottish Isles. In medieval winters, these sod walls were not only insulation but identity, binding people to the very land they lived upon. You push through the drift to one mound, brushing snow from its entrance. The door is low, forcing you to crouch. Inside, the world changes at once. Dark, close, but steady in its warmth. The thick earthen walls hold the heat of the fire, muffling the storm outside. The smell is earthy, like damp soil mixed with smoke and wool. The ceiling is low, lined with beams, and furs hang against the walls to trap even more warmth. The effect is striking. Outside, the wind shrieks. Inside, you hear only the quiet crackle of a fire and the murmur of voices. Families sit on benches built into the walls, their faces glowing red in the firelight. Children play with carved wooden toys on the packed dirt floor. An old woman spins wool, the spindle whirring softly. The air is thick, smoky, but comfortable. You feel as though the earth itself is holding you, wrapping its arms around your shivering body. A 13th century Icelandic saga describes a hall where the walls themselves were warm as flesh, a poetic exaggeration but one rooted in truth. Turf houses retained heat far better than stone or wood. Snow piled atop the roofs only added more insulation, turning them into snug burrows. The homes looked humble from the outside, but within they were marvels of efficiency. One quirky practice noted in Norse folklore: families sometimes sprinkled milk on the sod walls during storms, offering thanks to land, spirits for protection. The ritual blurred survival with reverence. Home was not just built of earth, it was alive with its spirit. Scholars still puzzle over how literally such customs were followed, but the persistence of the stories hints at deep cultural meaning. Debate continues among historians about how common turf houses were outside of Iceland and the Isles. Some argue they were rare in mainland Europe, used only in treeless zones. Others suggest they were more widespread, simply leaving fewer remains because the earth returned to earth. What cannot be denied is their effectiveness. Anyone who has stepped into one during a storm knows the difference between stone's chill and sod's embrace. You sit by the fire, feeling warmth seep slowly into your bones. The sod walls muffle the storm so completely that you almost forget the blizzard exists. Outside, the wind howls, but here you are cocooned in silence. The sensation is strange, almost womb-like, as if reborn in earth. Your eyelids grow heavy, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the earthy scent of turf. A peculiar anecdote from an Icelandic law code mentions fines for damaging turf on another's land, even if only to patch one's house. Turf was valuable, protected like timber elsewhere. Families guarded their grassy plots fiercely, knowing that without sod there was no shelter. This detail reveals how deeply survival depended not on abstract wealth, but on the simple right to cut earth. You open your eyes and look around again. Shadows flicker across the walls, highlighting ridges of packed grass and soil. The air tastes of smoke and dampness, but it is tolerable. Children drowse on their parents' laps, their faces peaceful. The storm is reduced to a faint whisper, as though the world outside has been buried. The sod house is not grand, not even pretty, but it is profoundly secure. The walls do not shake, the hides do not rattle, the snow cannot bury what is already of the ground. You realize why so many medieval communities clung to this design despite its simplicity. In a world of storms, the safest refuge was one that disappeared into the very earth the storm sought to conquer. And as you step back outside into the biting air, you glance over your shoulder. The mounds are nearly invisible beneath the snow, their chimneys smoking faintly. They look less like houses than like part of the land itself. And perhaps that is the secret, to survive winter, not by fighting it, but by sinking into the earth until spring remembers you. The sod huts fade behind you, their earthen walls swallowed by drifting snow. You march forward again, the storm swirling so thickly that the horizon vanishes. Your steps crunch over frozen ground, and then you hear it, the faint tinkling of bells and the steady thud of hooves. Shapes emerge out of the white, pack horses laden with goods, cloaks whipping behind riders. You've stumbled into a caravan on the move, its people forced to camp in the blizzard. Here you discover yet another strategy of survival, turning wagons and carts into makeshift shelters, or clustering travelers into tight camps where warmth was shared like currency. Picture the scene. Wagons are pulled into a circle, their wooden sides forming a barrier against the gale. Hides and canvas are stretched between them to create a canopy, though snow sags heavily across it. Fires are lit in the center, their smoke rising through gaps, sparks swirling upward into the storm. Merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers alike huddle in the glow, cloaks wrapped tightly, faces raw with cold. The snow piles against the wagon walls, insulating them just enough to keep the bitterest wind at bay. Records from medieval trade routes confirm this practice. Hanseatic merchants traveling across northern Europe mentioned camping in wagon forts during winter nights, and pilgrims' diaries describe similar shelters on roads to Santiago. The strategy served two purposes: protection from both weather and bandits. A circle of wagons was a wall of wood against more than one kind of danger. You climb into one wagon, brushing snow from its planks. Inside, it smells of wet wood, leather, and grain sacks. The boards creak under your weight. A blanket is draped over the entrance, holding in some of the fire's glow. It is cramped, but warmer than the open storm. You imagine families curled inside, children pressed between bales of cloth or sacks of wheat, parents whispering reassurances as the blizzard shrieks outside. A peculiar note in a pilgrim's journal tells of travelers spreading fresh-cut pine boughs across the snow within their wagon circle, creating a springy carpet that insulated against the frozen earth. The air would fill with the sharp, resinous scent of pine, a rare comfort in an otherwise grim night. To this day, the memory lingers in descriptions, the sound of needles crackling underfoot, the fragrance mingling with smoke and sweat. Scholars debate whether wagon camps were common for peasants or mainly a habit of long-distance traders. Some suggest only those wealthy enough to own carts could afford such protection. Others point out that even small groups of villagers might borrow or rent wagons when traveling, imitating the practice out of necessity. Whatever the case, it is clear that clustering together, whether with wood, hide, or simple closeness, was key. You sit near the central fire, feeling its heat battle the storm. Sparks drift upward, snowflakes hissing as they melt. Around you, voices rise and fall. A merchant grumbles about lost profits. A pilgrim sings softly to pass the time. A soldier sharpens his knife out of habit. Dogs bark at the edges of the circle, restless but vital. Their presence means warmth, watchfulness, and warning. One odd superstition survives in travelers' lore. Some believed tying red cloth to a wagon wheel would confuse the storm and keep snow from piling too high. Whether charm or coincidence, red scraps are indeed mentioned in records of caravan camps. Perhaps it was simply a way to mark wagons in the endless white. The air inside the circle grows heavy with human presence. Breath steams, mingling into a cloud. Cloaks stink of damp wool, boots of wet leather, and the fire adds its own layer of acrid smoke. It is far from pleasant, but the warmth is undeniable. In a storm where solitude meant death, togetherness becomes the only salvation. You imagine lying down beside the fire, body pressed against strangers. A horse snorts nearby, its flank radiating heat. A child whimpers, soothed by the lull of voices. Snow piles higher against the wagons, muffling the outside world until the camp feels half buried. Yet within, life pulses rough, smelly, noisy, but alive. A quirky anecdote from a Flemish merchant tells of waking in such a camp to find the snow had sealed every gap so tightly that the wagon circle resembled a fortress. He wrote, "The storm built our walls better than we did." In that strange alliance, nature became both enemy and ally, trying to smother, yet also insulating. You lean back, letting the fire's glow soak into your bones. The circle of wagons creaks in the wind, ropes straining, hides fluttering. The storm roars, but here, shielded by wood and closeness, you sense the stubborn rhythm of survival. It strikes you that this camp is a mirror of medieval life itself. Imperfect, improvised, fragile, yet held together by cooperation. No one survives alone. The wagons, the fire, the voices they weave, a net strong enough to catch one more dawn. The wagon camp fades into the swirling dark as you press forward again. Your boots crunch over ice-crusted snow, and your breath comes harsh, each exhale vanishing instantly into the gale. After hours of trudging, you catch sight of shapes that seem at first like small hills. As you draw closer, you realize they are deliberate structures, stone cairns and half-buried shelters carved directly into rock. These are the cliffside refuges, places where medieval shepherds and travelers cut into mountainsides or stacked stones against natural overhangs to build crude but enduring havens. You approach one. Its entrance a low arch, half hidden under snow. The rocks are rough, black against the whiteness, fitted together without mortar. The gaps are stuffed with moss and frozen clay, insulation against the storm. A faint orange glow leaks from within. You stoop and step inside, the sound of the storm muffling behind you. The air is smoky, heavy, but blessedly warmer. The fire burns in a shallow pit, its flames reflecting off the damp stone walls. Water drips slowly from the ceiling where snowmelt seeps through, hissing as it strikes the coals. Families huddle on mats of reeds and hides, pressed against the back wall to avoid the draft at the entrance. Their faces glow red in the firelight, eyes half closed with exhaustion. Evidence of such shelters remains in many parts of Europe. Archaeological surveys in the Alps and Pyrenees reveal shallow caves modified with low stone walls, sometimes showing traces of soot that date back centuries. Chronicles also mentioned snow huts built against cliff faces, where herders trapped in storms would pile stones, branches, and hides to create crude but life-saving dwellings. They were not permanent homes, but temporary sanctuaries cobbled together in hours, then abandoned to the elements once the skies cleared. You run your hand along the wall. The stone is rough, cold to the touch, but solid. Unlike wooden huts or hide tents, it does not shiver in the wind. The smell is damp, earthy, mixed with smoke. Every drop of water feels amplified in the silence, each hiss on the fire a reminder of the storm's reach. Yet here, behind stone, you feel safer than you have in days. One curious anecdote from a shepherd's tale describes men singing loudly in such shelters, believing the echoes in the rocks scare away spirits of the storm. The acoustics certainly add to the impression. Your own breath seems to bounce back at you, magnified. Some say these echoes gave rise to folk tales of mountain voices, ghostly warnings carried on the wind. Historians still argue whether these cliffside shelters were common practice or rare improvisations. Some point to widespread evidence of soot-blackened caves as proof that they were frequently used. Others suggest many of these marks come from hunting camps, not blizzard refuges, but whether occasional or habitual, the logic remains clear. When snow hunts you, stone is the surest shield. You sit near the fire, listening. The storm outside is reduced to a low, steady roar, like the ocean pounding a distant shore. Inside, the crackle of flames dominates, along with the faint shuffle of tired bodies. A child coughs softly, then curls deeper into a blanket. The heat from the stones, warmed by fire, radiates faintly, holding back the chill. The atmosphere is stark, but comforting. There is no grandeur here, no feasting or music, only survival. The smell of burning pine needles fills your lungs, sharp and resinous. Smoke curls upward, escaping through a crude vent at the roof. Sparks leap into the dark, briefly lighting the wet stone ceiling before vanishing. A quirky note in alpine folklore warns that one must never sleep closest to the entrance, for spirits of the storm would tug the soul out into the blizzard. Whether metaphor or superstition, the practice served a purpose, keeping the weakest family members farther inside, shielded by bodies from the draft. Even fear became strategy. You imagine lying down on the mats of reeds, the stone wall at your back cold but reassuring. Around you the shelter is crowded, every space filled. The storm outside rages, snow piling higher against the entrance, but the stones do not shift. They stand as they always have, immovable, indifferent, yet protective. In this borrowed hollow, people endure. You close your eyes and think of the countless winters these walls have seen. Centuries of storms beating on the cliffs, generations of travelers crouching in the same glow. Their voices and yours mingle in the echoes, layered across time. The storm may be eternal, but so too is the instinct to carve refuge from whatever the land allows. As you drift toward rest, one thought lingers. Sometimes the strongest shelter is not built anew, but discovered in the bones of the earth itself. Stone has no mercy, but it has endurance, and for those who trusted it, that endurance was enough. You leave the cliffside hollow behind, the smell of wet stone still clinging to your cloak. The storm drives you down into a wide plain, where the snow sweeps endlessly across frozen ground. The horizon vanishes into white, and for a moment it feels as though you're walking on the bottom of the sky. Then you notice shapes rising out of the snow, not huts, not houses, but long, low mounds arranged in careful rows. As you get closer, you realize they are turf longhouses, the kind used in settlements across Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Scandinavia. These were not temporary shelters. They were entire communities, designed to withstand months of deadly blizzards. Step through the narrow entrance tunnel, and the first thing you feel is a dramatic change in air. The passage is low, forcing you to crawl or stoop. Its purpose is clever. Cold wind gets trapped in the tunnel, leaving the main hall warmer. Push through the heavy hide flap, and suddenly you are inside a world of flickering firelight and earthy warmth. The walls are thick blocks of turf and stone, cut from the surrounding landscape, stacked until they are several feet deep. Above, the roof is timber-framed, then layered with more turf, creating insulation so dense that snow piled on top only makes it warmer. Inside, the hall is long and dim. A fire burns in the central hearth, smoke curling slowly upward to vents in the roof. Benches line the walls, piled with furs and straw. Families sit shoulder to shoulder, their faces ruddy in the firelight. The smell is heavy. Peat smoke, sweat, wool, and cooking broth. It clings to every surface, making your eyes water. Yet the air feels thick with life compared to the howling emptiness outside. Written descriptions from Norse sagas paint vivid images of such halls. Warriors drank mead by the hearth while snow buried the land. Farmers and fishermen sang songs to pass the long winter nights. These were not just shelters, they were social engines, holding entire households, sometimes dozens of people under one roof. A visitor described them as ships turned upside down, their timber frames reminiscent of a vessel carrying people across a sea of snow. One quirky detail from archaeology: some longhouses had small side rooms used to keep animals, their body heat helping warm the main hall. Imagine goats bleating softly in the shadows, cows shifting on straw, their breath mingling with the smoke of the hearth. The combination of animal warmth, fire, and human bodies created a microclimate that could hold steady even as blizzards roared outside. Scholars debate how comfortable these halls truly were. Some argue they were dark, smoky, and suffocating, breeding sickness during long confinement. Others insist they were ingeniously adapted, cozy in their own way, with social bonds strengthened by the enforced closeness. The truth, perhaps, lies in both. Life here was not easy, but it was survivable, and survival was the only standard that mattered. You sit on a bench, fur beneath you soft against the prick of straw. The fire crackles, casting orange light that dances across soot-dark rafters. Children play with carved toys on the floor. An elder sharpens a knife, his strokes rhythmic and calm. A woman stirs a pot that smells faintly of fish and onions, steam rising in thick clouds. Around you, voices hum low conversation, bursts of laughter, even the strains of a song weaving through the smoky air. A curious tidbit from Greenlandic folklore tells that during the longest storms, families entertained themselves with riddles and storytelling contests, sometimes lasting through the entire night. The winner was rewarded with an extra portion of ale or dried meat. To imagine riddles traded back and forth while snow piled silently against the turf walls is to glimpse how survival was not only physical but mental. Stories and games became fuel for endurance. The soundscape is layered, the whistle of wind muted by sod, the hiss of peat on the fire, the muffled bleat of animals, and the constant rise and fall of voices. It feels like being aboard a great wooden ship cutting through stormy seas. And in truth, that is what these longhouses were, ships for winter, carrying their passengers towards spring. You lie back against the wall, the turf surprisingly warm where it has soaked up the fire's heat. Your cloak smells of smoke already, but you don't mind. The blizzard outside is distant now, reduced to a dull growl. Inside, the hall vibrates with human presence alive, resilient, stubborn. As your eyes drift shut, you realize why these turf longhouses endured in memory and story. They were more than shelters. They were symbols of community. Alone, no one could outlast the winter. Together, under thick sod and shared firelight, entire settlements endured. In the heart of a medieval blizzard, survival was not about walls or roofs alone. It was about people, pressed shoulder to shoulder, refusing to let the cold silence them. You leave the longhouse behind, its smoky warmth still clinging to your hair, and strike out once more into the white void. The snow drifts higher here, sculpted into jagged ridges by the ceaseless wind. Each step feels heavier than the last, yet soon you notice odd shapes half sunken into the drifts, round domes of snow, low and glistening like pearls in the moonlight. At first you think they are natural mounds, but as you draw closer, you see the signs of human hands, the blocks cut clean, stacked in a spiral, each one carefully shaped. These are snow shelters, kin to what the Inuit would later perfect, but also known in some medieval contexts among northern hunters, trappers, and herders. Step toward one, and the silence deepens. The walls of snow are thick, gleaming faintly in the firelight spilling from a narrow entrance. You stoop to crawl inside, and the world shifts again. Outside, the storm rages. Inside, a soft hush wraps around you. The air is cool, but strangely steady, free from the biting wind. The snow itself insulates, holding warmth far better than the empty air could. Your breath fogs the interior, droplets glittering like frost on the curved ceiling. Accounts from Norse sagas and later Arctic travelogues hint at such shelters. Hunters caught in sudden storms sometimes dug directly into drifts, hollowing out caves to survive the night. Others cut blocks with axes, stacking them into domes sealed with fresh snow. While not permanent dwellings for medieval peasants, these snow huts were emergency refuges, improvised with skill and speed. You sit on a bed of spruce branches laid across the floor, the resinous smell sharp against the damp chill. Over you, the ceiling curves in perfect arcs, blocks fitted so neatly that they seem fused. A tiny lamp burns in the center, its wick floating in animal fat. The flame glows golden, casting faint shadows across the crystalline walls. Light refracts strangely, as though the whole dome were a lantern. One curious observation comes from a missionary who traveled in northern Scandinavia. He marveled that inside such huts, he could sit barehanded for hours, though outside his skin froze in minutes. He even noted that snow walls absorbed sound, making conversations feel intimate and secret. To sit here now, listening to your own heartbeat amplified in the hush, you understand his astonishment. Scholars still debate how common these structures were in medieval Europe. Some argue they were rare, limited to Sami hunters and Arctic explorers. Others suggest that snow caves and block shelters were a widespread fallback, used whenever storms caught people far from permanent homes. With few physical remains, the argument rests on scattered written notes and oral traditions. What is certain is that the principle works. You can feel it now. The calm, the absence of wind, the strange comfort carved from snow itself. The soundscape inside is delicate. The storm outside is reduced to a muted growl. Meltwater drips softly from the ceiling, hissing on the fat lamp. Breath echoes faintly, as though the dome itself is breathing with you. Children giggle softly, amused at the way their voices bounce off the curved walls. Parents hush them, but even the hushing feels warm, a reminder that laughter is still possible in the midst of blizzards. A quirky tidbit from folklore claims that sleeping in snow shelters gave people prophetic dreams, as though the white walls carried whispers from the storm. Hunters supposedly awoke with visions of game trails or safe paths. Whether truth or fancy, the idea shows how much reverence people held for the very element they feared. Snow was not only a killer, but a guardian, if shaped with respect. You lie down now, cloak pulled tight, body pressed against the spruce bedding. The smell of smoke and resin clings to your nose. The lamp flickers, golden against icy blue walls, and for a moment the space feels otherworldly, like resting inside a jewel. Outside, snow hammers relentlessly, but the hut does not tremble. It is paradoxical. What kills you in the open saves you when shaped into walls. The atmosphere makes you reflective. Unlike smoky huts or crowded barns, snow shelters are clean in their silence, their stillness almost sacred. You imagine hunters whispering tales here, their voices hushed by the weight of white above. Perhaps they spoke of gods, or spirits, or simply of tomorrow's tasks. Whatever the words, the shelter held them safe long enough to speak. As your eyes close, you understand why these domes of snow persisted in memory and story. They prove that survival often comes from turning danger into defense, from making an enemy into an ally. The storm provides both the threat and the solution. Snow that blinds and freezes also forms the walls that keep you alive. When you crawl out of the snow dome, the storm is still there, waiting, snarling, endless, heavy. The wind claws at your cloak, and the cold gnaws at your fingers, but you walk on, leaving the glittering mound behind. The ground dips suddenly, and you find yourself in a ravine. The sides rise steep, and through the swirling flakes you see dark mouths cut into the rock. At first you think they are caves, but as you approach you realize they are mines' abandoned shafts and tunnels left behind by medieval prospectors. And here too people once found shelter. Mining was common across medieval Europe, from the silver veins of Saxony to the salt caverns of Poland. When storms descended on the mountains, miners and travelers alike sometimes took refuge in the tunnels, huddling by the entrance or deeper within. The rock, cold and damp, offered no comfort, but it did block the wind. Chronicles from 14th century Bohemia mention men trapped in blizzards who survived by retreating into shafts until skies cleared. You step inside one of the tunnels. The air changes immediately. Colder in one sense, yet still, no longer whipped raw by the storm. Your footsteps echo off stone walls, damp and rough. Drops of water fall from the ceiling, each splash magnified in the silence. Farther in, a group of figures crouches near a small fire, their faces shadowed, cloaks drawn tight. The smoke curls upward, only to drift back down, trapped in the stagnant air. You cough, tasting the sharpness of burning pine and the metallic tang of stone. It is not comfort, but it is survival. The rock walls hold steady while the storm rages above. The fire gives enough warmth to keep frostbite away. families pressed together, packs serving as pillows, straw strewn across the ground where miners once worked. The smell is heavy wet earth, smoke, sweat, and the faint stench of sulfur from veins in the rock. Archaeological digs in Central Europe have uncovered soot marks on abandoned shafts, evidence that fires were indeed lit there after mining ceased. Some shafts even show rough stone walls built to block drafts, suggesting that they were reused as shelters long after the ore was gone. It seems strange to us now, but to medieval villagers, the abandoned mine was a ready-made refuge, already carved by human hands. One curious superstition appears in mining folklore. People believed spirits called kobolds haunted the tunnels, knocking to warn or sometimes mislead humans. Taking shelter in such places meant not only facing cold and damp, but also, in the medieval imagination, facing these unseen inhabitants. Some families carried charms, iron crosses, sprigs of juniper to hang at the entrance, begging the spirits permission to rest. Scholars remain divided on how frequently mines were used as storm shelters. Some argue they were last resorts, only for those truly trapped. Others suggest it was common practice in mining regions, where locals knew every shaft and cave. The debate continues, but the logic is undeniable. When stone already offers a hole, why not use it? You sit beside the imagined fire, feeling its smoke cling to your cloak. The sounds of the storm above are muted, but faintly present, a low rumble echoing through the stone. Children sleep fitfully, their faces pressed against their mothers' shoulders. Men whisper about the weather, their voices hushed, as though unwilling to disturb the spirits of the mine. The atmosphere is tense, not restful, but endurance hums quietly in every movement. A quirky anecdote from a Polish tale tells of miners who, trapped by a blizzard, marked the hours by tossing pebbles into a pool of water. The ripples became their clock, keeping them sane when they had no light of day. When they finally emerged, the storm had passed, but they swore they still heard the pebbles splashing in their dreams. The soundscape around you is stark, water dripping, fire sputtering, stone creaking faintly under unseen pressure. It is a shelter that feels alive, almost oppressive, yet it holds. And in that holding, life persists. As you rest against the cold wall, your body protests the damp chill, but you know the alternative would be worse. Better to breathe smoke and moisture here than to freeze stiff beneath the open sky. The medieval world was full of such compromises, where comfort was secondary to mere survival. At last you push back toward the entrance, brushing soot from your hands. Snow swirls against the rocks, the blizzard still raging. Behind you, the mine remains a hollow womb carved by men chasing ore, later claimed by those chasing warmth. And you understand that even in places meant for work and wealth, survival found its way. The mine's damp breath follows you back into the storm, and you cough to clear the taste of stone from your mouth. The blizzard has not eased. If anything, the snow falls heavier now, muffling the world in white silence. You trudge forward blindly until you spot a cluster of strange shapes in the distance, rounded, sagging structures half swallowed by drifts. Their frames are wood, but their walls shine pale in the storm's dim light. As you draw closer, you realize they are plastered with frozen mud and clay, reinforced by straw, mud huts hardened by frost. Even in the medieval world, where stone and timber reigned, earth itself was often pressed into service as walls against winter. Step inside one, and the air changes at once. The entrance is low, blocked with a hide flap. Beyond it lies a single room, walls of packed clay and straw rising around you like baked loaves of bread. The hearth burns small but steady in the center. Its smoke clings to the low ceiling, staining it black, but the warmth is unmistakable. The smell hits you instantly: wet earth, scorched straw, and smoke thick as wool. The storm's roar is muted now, turned into a faint hum behind heavy walls. Medieval records confirm the use of earth huts in areas where stone was scarce and timber too precious. In parts of Eastern Europe, families built their winter cottages half of mud, half of wood, relying on thick daub walls to hold heat. Some accounts even mention winter pits, semi-subterranean homes dug into the ground with mud-plastered walls above, roofed with turf or timber. Archaeologists have uncovered such structures in Poland and Ukraine, small, crude, yet cleverly insulated by Earth's steady temperature. You run your hand across the wall. It is rough, cool to the touch, and bits of straw jut out where clay has flaked. Yet the thickness is reassuring. Each layer of earth acts as armor against the blizzard, storing the fire's heat and releasing it slowly. The wall feels alive, breathing warmth back into the room. Inside, the family crowds close to the hearth. Children sit cross-legged on woven mats, their cheeks red, eyes half closed with drowsiness. A mother turns a pot of stew, its steam carrying the scent of barley and onions. A father mends harness straps by the firelight, his knife scraping against leather. Life continues, pressed small into the earth's embrace. One curious tidbit survives in folklore. In some villages, people whispered that the mud in their walls carried the memory of summer fields. To sleep against it was to dream of grass, warmth, and the hum of bees. Whether poetic or not, it reveals how earth walls became more than shelter. They were reminders of seasons promised to return. Historians debate how durable these huts truly were. Some argue they collapsed easily under heavy snow, leaving families exposed. Others point to archaeological remains that lasted centuries, suggesting they were sturdier than assumed. Perhaps the truth lies in constant maintenance. Walls patched every spring, roofs reinforced each autumn, always one storm away from collapse yet renewed by human hands. You lie back on a straw mat, cloak pulled tight. The fire's glow flickers across the clay walls, illuminating patterns of cracks and soot. Smoke prickles your eyes, but the warmth is undeniable. Outside, snow hisses against the roof, but here you feel steady, cocooned by soil and straw. A quirky anecdote from a 14th century chronicle tells of peasants sealing cracks in their walls with butter during a particularly harsh winter, claiming it both blocked the draught and appeased house spirits. To us it sounds absurd, but in the grip of a storm, any substance at hand became building material. The walls became patchwork testaments to ingenuity: mud, straw, dung, butter all fused together to hold out the cold. The soundscape here is humble. The low hiss of the fire, the murmur of tired voices, the occasional drip where melting snow seeps through the roof. It is not grand, but it is alive. Compared to the vast silence outside, this room hums with survival. As you stretch on the mat, warmth seeping slowly into your bones, you realize how many millions of winter nights were spent in such spaces, unremarkable, invisible to history books, but vital. Stone castles and monasteries might dominate chronicles, but most of humanity endured storms in clay and straw. These huts, humble though they seem, were the backbone of medieval endurance. When at last you rise and push aside the hide flap, the blizzard claws at you again. Behind you, the mud hut squats low against the snow, walls sagging but unbroken. It is not beautiful, not even sturdy by noble standards, yet it holds. And in that holding, it carries the same truth you've seen in barns, caves, and castles alike. Shelter is never about perfection, it is about persistence. The mud hut recedes into the swirling dark, its earthy smell still clinging to your cloak. The storm shows no sign of mercy, yet your steps carry you onward, as if the land itself insists you witness one more lesson in survival. Soon you reach the edge of a forest, its branches weighed down by snow, creaking like old timbers in the wind. Nestled among the trees are scattered huts smaller than longhouses, rougher than barns, but arranged in a cluster that feels deliberate. This is not one family's refuge, but a village united, neighbors leaning on one another to endure the storm. Step between the huts, and you sense the difference immediately. Paths are dug through the drifts, narrow tunnels of packed snow connecting door to door. Smoke pours from every roof, rising into the dark like silent prayers. The sound of voices filters through the night, shouts, laughter, even the faint notes of a fiddle. Here, survival is not solitary. It is shared, multiplied, woven together. You push open the door of one cottage and are swept into a whirl of warmth and noise. The room is crowded, far more than its walls were meant to hold. Families from outlying farms have all crammed inside, fleeing the blizzard for the safety of numbers. Children chase one another around the hearth, their feet scattering rushes across the floor. Women ladle soup into wooden bowls, passing them hand to hand. Men mend harnesses, sharpen tools, or simply sit with mugs of ale, their breath steaming in the smoky air. One mainstream historical detail confirms this scene. Manorial rolls from across Europe, record fines, suspended during winter, for those who gathered for warmth. Lords knew well that peasants banded together in harsh weather, and even legal systems bent to survival. Alone a family might perish. Together, they could pool food, share blankets, and keep watch over fires without rest. The smell here is intoxicating wood smoke, mingled with onions, cabbage, and salted pork. It clings to your skin, filling your lungs until you feel heavy with it. Yet it is comforting too. After the sharp cold of the storm, the odor of cooking feels like a promise of life. One quirky anecdote from a French village account tells of families stringing ropes across rooms so children would not stumble into the fire at night in the crush of bodies. Another mentions neighbors singing psalms in shifts, keeping the rhythm alive so no one drifted into despair. These details remind you that survival was not just physical, but communal, shaped by ritual and routine. Historians debate whether these gatherings were truly joyful or simply desperate. Some records describe nights of laughter, feasting, and dancing storm turned into festival. Others portray them as cramped, smoky, and rife with tension. Perhaps both were true. Human nature bends easily in either direction, and a blizzard could turn neighbors into allies or rivals depending on hunger and mood. You sit near the hearth, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers. The fire roars, sparks leaping toward the soot-dark rafters. The storm outside is reduced to a faint hum, as though the walls themselves are thick with voices drowning out its howl. Around you, stories are told, tales of saints who tamed storms, of wolves driven back by prayer, of ancestors who survived even harsher winters. Each story becomes a shield, layering protection as real as any wall. A curious fragment of folklore describes how some villages hung iron pots upside down above doors during storms, claiming it confused the wind. Others painted charms on shutters, spirals meant to twist the storm's fury away. Whether or not these worked, they reveal how deeply people believed in collective defense, not only with tools but with symbols. The soundscape is lively. Children giggling, mugs clattering, logs hissing as they split in the fire. Somewhere in the corner, a fiddler scrapes out a tune, his bow jerking to match the storm's rhythm. Feet stomp softly on the rushes, half dance, half effort to stay warm. The storm may rage outside, but inside, the village insists on life. You stretch your legs, feeling warmth seep into muscles stiff from endless trudging. The room is crowded, yes, and the smoke prickles your eyes, but it is joyous too. There is resilience in this press of bodies, a defiance written not in stone or sod, but in laughter. And as you lean back, closing your eyes, you realize the truth. Of all the shelters you have seen, snow domes, sod huts, castles, barns, this is the most human. A village gathered together, turning fear into festival, blizzard into backdrop. The medieval world knew no storm too fierce when neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder. The blizzard will pass, the snow will melt, spring will return, and when it does, these families will remember not only the fear, but the warmth of being together, alive, in the darkest nights. Now, as the storm at last softens in your imagination, let the rhythm of these stories slow. Picture the snow easing its assault, flakes drifting more gently, like feathers settling on the earth. The winds no longer claw, but sigh, weaving softly through branches. Fires burn low, their embers glowing steady, no longer struggling, simply breathing. You walk once more through every shelter you have visited. The smoky huts, the haylofts, the sod houses, the stone refuges. Each one still hums with life voices murmuring, children sleeping, fires whispering. You realize they were never just walls or roofs. They were determination made visible, love made tangible, fear turned into ingenuity. The air is gentler now. Your body, tired from so much trudging, finds ease.